It is my great honor to salute you today at the 17th Anti-Corruption Conference, organized traditionally by months at the end of the year. We are soon to come of age, and we hope that next year we celebrate our maturity with less criticism, with better track record, and some concrete results in the area. It is my great pleasure to ask the Prime Minister of Montenegro, Mr. Spajić, to open this conference formally. You have the floor. Thank you, Ćalović, Marković, ladies and gentlemen. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come together to take stock of what corruption in Montenegro. When our government started the mandate, we clearly send the message that the corruption, together with integration activities and improving the living standard of citizens, are our major priorities. Increasing salaries and pensions and the stuff related to that earned us the EBAR. And after a long-term, many-year-long stagnation, we have come closer to European perspective. And we want to, we can say that we command the minimum, the rule of law. And I underscore minimum, so it is yet to be improved on many counts. And we promised and we have given some promises and we have delivered on them beyond. As for anti-corruption legislation, the Commission found it good. The new anti-corruption strategy was adopted and we didn't have it before. 10 years. We have the new council for the anti-corruption agency, and we have seen some changes there. We have introduced some new forms of criminal offenses, procurement, bankruptcy procedure-related corruptions, and others. And Greco found it as a well-delivered recommendation, well-implemented recommendation. The law on lobbying was adopted, and we plan to have a new law on whistleblowers. Therefore, the law on lobbying, we have already adopted some 9 bylaws. We have improved the law on prosecution of proceeds of crime, and our team from the Ministry of Justice also work on the seizure of illegally acquired property. We also work on relieving the prosecutorial structures to relieve them of the workload so as to dedicate to the prosecutions of organized crime. Then we have also done some improvements related to the special police team. We have also prepared things to control the properties of police officers. We have started high on fight against corruption in education. We also have some 29 criminal reports already, and we have started procedures. Also, the sector for fight against crime have also made arrests of some police officers, some high officials, and else. And this is something that brought us to avoid to get the reports, to keep us in SEPA membership, and to avoid being put on gray lists. We have already introduced the salaries according to the level of responsibilities. Also, in corruption, we can't allow and let go of selectivity. I also say that there are lots of things that lie in store, and we should look at that critically. We are to have the tax police. The tax police will be the embryo of the tax police will be in the tax directorate, tax and revenue directorate, and we expect to see that the tax police works on amending the law on tax administration, and we need to amend on the amendments of the income tax. That is why, and I started working on that even before my mandate. If someone has acquired income and didn't report it, we should tax it with 80% of the tax on it. And this is one of the speediest ways to act. And we believe that we should look upon expect the support from Gada di Financia that we would like to actually copy and replicate better their model. And we believe that the state will get significant revenue from there. We would go into the in-depth checks, and we also have reforms that we started with our American friends, and it is edge reform. That is how to find UBOs, ultimate beneficiary owners, meaning the real owners of corporations and companies, NGOs, and other entities. So why is that the case? We want to curb the financing of terrorism, financing of any other criminal activities, money laundering, etc. As we know that this is typically used for those illegal activities. Our country does not have enough capacity to fight against that. When you see that someone is owner of a company from Seychelles, from Cayman, from Virgin Islands, so we can't do much as the state. We can't get the information as to who is the real owner. Apart from the criminals and corrupted people, we are going to prosecute the people who have been under sanctions and who use the loopholes in our present system to escape the impact of sanctions. As for the law, anti-corruption legislation, I want to say, and activities, I want to say that this law has to be made much better, way better than it is right now. I think that NGOs were pretty vocal on that, and they have put many reserves about that. Statutory limitation is something that is very concerning, and Vanja mentioned that many times. Sorry for getting beyond my script, but I wanted to say that this law has to be reconsidered. A statutory limitation should be much longer, and to give to enable anti-corruption agency to act against them. As for the port of Bar and counterfeit over there, we've been through the process of curbing the activities of the smuggling and counterfeit together with our British friends, and I salute you. And you might believe that this was just business as usual, but it was not. It was very complex undertaking, and then the port of Bar and the toxic environment in which they work was very difficult, and with the help of special prosecutor's offices, a gatekeeper, SPO as a gatekeeper, we managed to curb the activity. The Customs Directorate was with us throughout the process. In the port of Bar, you have three entities running the processes over there. And there are some who might maliciously think that Port of Bar has been made tripartite so as to be abused and misused. I believe that someone can use this inefficiency in this setting to to do crimes, criminal activities, and we, together with our German friends, try to do due diligence of the part that is run by Adria, Port of Adria. And there we will consider an option, of course, depending on the conditions and price, to have the state repurchase it and to put it under the umbrella of the state and to be a unique entity, the Port of Bar. Once we finish the reform, we will look for partners to find partners or to make a concession or to make a next management model or so. We will be looking for partners who can work by NATO standards as we want to make this port working in full capacity. We visited Singapore and we saw PSA. It is a symphony to look at from the balcony. Let alone closer. We can't, that is far-fetched ideal for us. And we saw, and I was looking at that from the balcony as you can't approach it. You have robots doing operations and you preempt and rule out any corruption as robots cannot engage in corruptions. So, and in corruptive activities. So, aside from that, what we need is automatization of procedures and efficiency. Singapore is TU second in the world after Shanghai. They could only they were the only ones to live up to the challenge to compete against good Chinese ports. Spoke Chinese in Greece made a very good hit with that, and the turnover is huge. So Port of Bar could be that competitive edge, and we could be that part of trade coming from the Middle East and East and South. We also look at Montenegro hinterland. We have a population of 500,000, underdeveloped trades and production, and we are pretty limited for that path. for the exploit part, and it would be mean underuse of port of bar, meaning that we need much more, and we need to have the trade lines that would go through. So this is in hinterlands, and we should talk to all these countries who could care for and find useful to ship the goods through this port. We need to rule out and to eliminate the mistakes we made before. As for other reforms, we are aware that we face the money laundering, and this goes beyond what we could handle alone. And we are very happy to become a member of SEPA system, and it brings benefits to citizens and to economy alike, and the processes of payment will be much easier. We will be on the other side more transparent and better connected with anti-money laundering mechanisms, and we don't tend to speak much about that, even though this is the true place, the right place to mention that. As you know, we are members of SEPA formally, and we are a member of geographic area. It was us, and after that, Albania, after a couple of hours, Albania, because Tirana did a very good job, and we expect other countries of the Western Balkans to join soon. It'll be only in April that ECB will develop fully the system of having Montenegro. We believe that 15 January will be that date, and we believe that we will, and our system will be ready in June and July. They are a bit and I'm not critical in this context. We understand why banks are hesitating. Uh, and I know that they used to get commissions and earn from commissions of the different transactions through SEPA. It won't be the case, and that is why they are a bit, maybe, should I say, slow at working in on this process. As for other reforms, I've mentioned the law on confiscation of proceeds of crime. I want to say that we have a working group working on that. And apart from tax part, which is important, as I come from the financial background, I want to say that tax and revenue directorate is much more potent than it might seem, and they are they're instrumental in prosecuting crimes and investigating and prosecuting crimes. They are essential in true fights and meaningful fights against organized crime and corruption. It is very important that these mechanisms work well, because they'll prepare field for prosecution to confiscate proceeds. As for digitalization, I want to say it's very important to say something that I very often talk about. It is data warehouse project. That is a many-year program that is to make a database and digital fiscalization that we started to work on and delayed. I remember that in the parliament I launched the first motion to delay the digital fiscalization for the mid 20 21 to get ready for that, and we haven't done much in the field. We hadn't before, and I can comment that our colleagues from DPS prepared regulation, but implementation was stopped until we came. So for 7, 8 months, we worked on that, and fiscalization is good for one side as we collect lots of data, and on the other side, what is bad is that we don't have the warehouse for data, so that these data are put in the black hole somewhere, stored away into the dark. And we need to retrieve them and to make time series in Excel to manage to do some in-depth analysis. We don't have the data warehouse, and the World Bank is in charge, and we have inserted a short clause that will extend the project but make it better, reinforce the couple of aspects, working together with different departments. It will materialize in 2 years earliest, and as we are to develop software and we have to work with the World Bank. This is the most potent tool in fight against corruption and organized crime. We think that this will bring us to track down sorts of things, all sorts of things automatically, and the checks will be done automatically. And even the small amounts will be cross-checked by computer, whereas big checks will be done by professionals, and they might bring up the red flags and essentially cover. We will have to define the threshold to be 100,000 euros and up or so, because if we lower this threshold, it will be too much. Everything that goes beyond that threshold will be automatically checked. And this brings back the trust into the rule of law. When we speak of rule of law, it has become a worn out phrase because it was spent last years. First of all, what is it about? It is equal treatment in equitable way. And on the other side is that these people perceive that they are living in a state, in a country that respects the rules and norms and rights. And this perception has to be improved. Whatever the state does, and if the citizens don't believe in that, then the state can operate and anyway, but with or without perception. But perception, when perception is wrong, it is equally detrimental, because if they tolerate and look at that like that, they could engage themselves and in corruptive practices. And this is what is important, that every citizen should understand that tax reporting is and tax filing is civic duty. And people in the States, for example, they would be always They are most concerned if IRS would check them if they haven't reported tax well. So I think that the tax is very important. Tax administration is very important, and it is in the pinnacle of fight against organized crime and corruption. It is invisible pinnacle. For example, in Singapore, tax revenue directorate or administration it collects 90%, and it has the tool, and it is a tool, and it renders tools for all other administrations and institutions to do their own duty. I declare the conference open now.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for this exhaustive and very interesting introduction. I would like to ask His Excellency Ambassador of the EU to Montenegro, Mr. Johann Sattler, to address us. You have the floor. Good morning from my side. Thanks to the organizers for organizing this very important conference, and congratulations for the 17th conference.
But of course, the expectation is that not only you grow, you become mature, but also you will show results. And that's why I'm very happy to be here, dear Prime Minister, dear colleagues. Let me start with a simple truth. If democracy thrives, corruption fails. And democracy is growing, corruption is diminishing. Because corruption is the distortion of democratic rules. Corruption practices are based on what is called the 4 Ps: preference, power, privilege, and payment. I repeat, preference, power, privilege, and payment. Where democracy is based on equality of treatment, respect, obligations, and rights. Corruption deepens inequalities, erodes citizens' trust in public institutions, and undermines social justice. This is why any democratic country, and even more so, a country like Montenegro, which aspires to become the next member of the European Union, must engage in preventing and fighting corruption. It's no secret that corruption has an enormous economic cost. By creating a business uncertainty and hampering fair competition, it has an established negative impact on economic growth. Provide a scale, and I take here the figures from the European Union also to show that corruption is something which is present in the European as well. But the important thing is to realize that and to increase all the instruments we have at our power. We, by the way, in the European Union, established a few years ago the European Public Prosecutor to exactly look after the financial interest of the European Union. And since 7 years, this courageous lady, Ms. Ćalović, is sitting in Luxembourg, going through all the European Union countries, and is very much active fighting corruption and organized crime in the European Union. So to provide you with a scale of the problem, in the European Union, the corruption costs in the European Union are between these days 4 and 6% of the GDP, between 4 and 6% of GDP. That's in numbers about 850 billion euros. Now, I don't know the exact figures from this country, but experts tell me there is a scale similar and probably higher to those figures also here in Montenegro. Now, the good news is, and the Prime Minister mentioned it, you have moved this Montenegro. This last year was a productive one. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here going into the Intergovernmental Conference next week and closing chapters. Because chapter 23 and 24 are the alpha and omega of the accession process. They are and they will remain. And this is what was necessary. This was the minimum necessary, this interim benchmarks, in order to move to closing chapters. But of course, we all know that for the closing benchmarks for chapters 23 and 24, much more is needed. And here, the magic sentence is to establish a track record in fighting organized crime and corruption. So I think it's laudable. And I'm somebody who is convinced to praise where praise is due. And in this respect, the progress of Montenegro in this last year was a good one. was a positive one and now allows us to go forward. If all 27 members agree next week to have an intergovernmental conference. But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic we'll be having this intergovernmental conference, and I'm optimistic we'll be closing those chapters, which are ready. This is chapter 7, 10. The negotiator knows them all by heart. If you wake him up at night, 20 and 31. Now, in moving forward, what needs to happen? In order to fulfill the closing benchmarks, the work needs to continue in a similar, if not faster pace, in order to upgrade first the legislative framework. Prime Minister mentioned some of the laws. Let me add one more here, which is also a leftover from the EBAR exercise from summer, which is the law on financing of political parties and campaigns. Something very, very important. Happy to hear from the two co-chairs that work is being finalized and will be still getting this month a first draft, which is going to be sent to Brussels. This is very, very important. But of course, speaking about electoral reform, this will be a kind of a test if Montenegro is ready also to embark on a broader electoral reform, which needs to happen. We all remember there are many, many ODIHR recommendations on transparency on the election process, which are not implemented. This is the occasion now next year to really focus on that. And let me add also focus on including in the changes also the provision that you have local elections in one day every 4 years. I love Beran, believe me, and Andreina and Kuzin, yeah. But it's not healthy that we talk here on the national level about these elections for weeks and months. It's not healthy. And it's something I believe where we have a chance next year to really close that chapter and provide the provisions, prepare the provisions to have a different kind of electoral setting. So on fighting corruption, organized crime, the legal framework is important, and I encourage the parliament to move when it comes to the laws, especially also the law on financing of political parties. What else do we need? Well, the sentence which I mentioned before is this building up of a solid and sustained track record in fighting organized crime and corruption. Here we have now in the prosecution on the top level individuals who are ready and able to do their job. That's good. And we have seen some first results there. I'm also heartened by one other very important thing which happened last week, which was the appointment of the Supreme Court president, also a leftover of the EBAR. I had my first meeting with the president last week, and without giving away any details from this meeting, let me assure you that one thing came up a lot during my first meeting, which was a solid track record in fighting organized crime and corruption. This is something, this will be the yardstick against which we'll measure the work of the judiciary and also of the Supreme Court in the years to come. Now, let me also say here, well, one more thing maybe when it comes to judiciary building up, fight against organized crime and corruption, all those things which were mentioned here before. There is an additional element in the discussion. It's a very positive element because there is a reward linked to it. It's called the growth plan. The Prime Minister mentioned SEPA. This is one of the first things coming out of the growth plan, something very positive for all citizens of this country. The growth plan also has benchmarks when it comes to judiciary and rule of law. I checked this morning, there are 3 benchmarks which are related to this area, and there's money attached to it. There's about 14 million euros attached to the benchmarks, like filling finally or giving the resources to the specialized department in the Podgorica court for fighting corruption, organized crime. There's also the other thing which was mentioned here before, which is the tax administration, customs and tax. This is one of the benchmarks in the growth plan to establish a better system, to have checks, integrity checks, and so on. And of course, the bigger one by 26 to have this track record established on fighting organized crime and corruption. So it's not only the right thing to do for the politicians and the parliament of this country to work in this area, but it's also a reward attached to it. So if you don't do that, there won't be financial rewards. And I think this is something which is healthy. I think also something which can build up pressure in order to really achieve and do these benchmarks. And I'm happy to hear that, I don't know if it's true, Prime Minister, but the government sessions now also include always a part on the implementation of the growth plan of the benchmarks. I think this is something very, very positive. So coming to a close, I believe that it's been a good year on that front. Much more needs to come. I'm happy that there is now the realization that this indeed chapters 23, 24 are the alpha and omega of the process. Without progress there, without fulfilling the benchmarks and starting to move towards the closing benchmarks of chapter 23 and 24, there will not be the accession to the European Union. And it makes me optimistic and positive that we have started well, but of course, the proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating, and we are very much looking forward to more results in this very important area. And hopefully when we come back to your full maturity conference next year, we'll have exactly those results. Thank you.
Excellency, it is my great pleasure to ask the Ambassador of the United States of America, Mr. Reinke, to address you.
Hvala Vanja i dobro jutro svima. Good morning, everyone. And Prime Minister, thank you for being part of the conference and for giving your extemporaneous remarks. I think that's very valuable for all of us here to hear what's on your mind in the area of anti-corruption. Appreciate that. Members of MON's distinguished panel of excellencies and members of the audience, including ministers, friends, and members of the media, thank you for being here. The 17th annual conference of anti-corruption is really important time to get together because this is a gray day on a very gray subject, and yet there's a light at the end of the tunnel, which you've just been hearing about. And I think there's some optimism in the air given the progress that has been made towards the original IBAR and the EU accession, but so much work needs to be done. And hence MON's continued focus on anti-corruption and holding these annual conferences is an important milestone every year. This particular conference, as you know, is held on Anti-Corruption Day, UN Anti-Corruption Day. And it makes me pleased that we're meeting on this specific day, the 9th of December, which marks the UN Convention Against Corruption and the day it came into force. That particular convention is a comprehensive set of standards, measures, and rules that remains as relevant today as it did when it was passed more than 20 years ago. The language of the convention is very specific and very useful. It really did galvanize the international community. It said the international community is determined to prevent and control corruption. And it went further, echoing something that the Prime Minister said. Corruption is a betrayal of the public trust, and it will no longer be tolerated. And hence, these conferences are really important to remind ourselves that we cannot tolerate that kind of malicious and criminal behavior. The day reminds us of the devastating impact of corruption and the need for action by the government, civil servants, and citizens themselves to detect, deter, and if necessary, mitigate corruption. So on that level, I want to commend civil society in general and MONS in particular for tireless efforts to increase public awareness of corruption's corrosive effects on society, for advocating for greater transparency within the public sector, and for straight out exposing corruption where it exists. And those exposures have been so helpful in this fight. Hiding corruption will never solve anything, but exposing it is the first step to allowing society and the government to finally eradicate this curse. As I've said before, no country is immune. In the United States, we take the threat seriously, and we consider countering corruption a core national security concept. In fact, we know that corruption eats away at the fabric of society, leading to systemic weaknesses, even breakdowns of government processes. Corruption creates a sense of impunity for the actors, and it weakens trust, which is needed for a democracy to survive. So hence, in my country, this is not just a plain crime. This is a crime that eats at democracy and therefore is a national security interest. Montenegro, as the ambassador from the EU mentioned, has a unique opportunity. It's not alone. And because of its accession to the EU, all of the combined efforts of the member states, the Commission, and even its friends and partners outside the UN are available to it as it fights corruption. Montenegro has made important progress, as we've just referred to, but we know the path ahead is not without challenges, because these are difficult reforms, and no one is denying that. It is critical to fight corruption to ensure long-term stability and progress, the very promises that this government was founded on. The reforms won't be easy, but they'll be worth it. And sometimes hard work is really what makes you know that you're making progress. You'll ensure a safer, more secure, and equitable future if you continue on the path you're on, Prime Minister. Only through a multi-sectoral approach will you be successful, because this is not just one sector, it's the entire, the whole of government. To get there, government and elected officials must constantly remember they have a responsibility to the citizens. Public service, and this is what I referred to last year when I addressed this conference, public service is synonymous with honesty, transparency, and a steadfast commitment to the wellness of society. That's what it should be. Frankly, that's what it is. Citizens expect and deserve transparency, accountability, and ethical conduct from public servants. Public corruption erodes democratic institutions, and nepotism, which is a kind of corruption, stymies the public administration from capably and effectively serving its citizens. So please remember your public service reforms as you look at the entire panoply of the things you're working on. Tax and customs is important, but the functioning of the public services is equally, if not more important. Judiciary and prosecution also have critical roles, as the Prime Minister referred to. They need to hold individuals accountable through independence, and they need to be independent organizations and fair trial. In this way, justice is served to the citizens and the country, but keep in mind that justice delayed is justice denied. And that's something I've been concerned about, the slow process of justice. Justice must be delivered professionally, but also swiftly. Another area of reform to focus on. Civil society, I've made reference to it before, but these organizations play such a critical role and need to be respected for their critical functions. They raise awareness for the detrimental effects of corruptions, and they scrutinize the action of government officials and institutions. They help build stronger, more accountable democracies and societies. They're the heroes in this conversation, and they should be respected. When they criticize, that's a gift, not something to be feared, but rather to be embraced. And finally, I look at all of you and everyone who is thinking about anti-corruption on this day, the citizens. By speaking out against injustice and advocating for change, by being courageous and resilient, citizens can contribute to countering corruption. Citizens can't stay quiet. There are many brave individuals in Montenegro, and over my tenure, I've met many of them, the guardians of justice and integrity who inspire and challenge. Those are the people that need to be embraced as well. I encourage you all to raise your voices, and I know by being here today that you do. As for the United States, we remain steadfast in supporting Montenegro and strengthening its criminal justice system and other institutions. We have a United States strategy on countering corruption that highlights the importance of addressing the nexus between corruption and criminal and other illicit activities. As I've mentioned, it's a national security priority for us. Transnational organized crime destabilizes. As you know, groups collide with public officials to shield, and in an effort to shield themselves from prosecution and accountability. These transnational criminal organizations also operate across borders, undermining the international financial system and complicating law enforcement efforts. This is why we have to work together. Transnational criminal organizations tend to stay one step ahead of us, and therefore we must all be aware. We also know organized crime is backed by corrupt actors who can destabilize the rule of law. And the Prime Minister said, we get tired of hearing rule of law. It is jargon, but it is exactly the core of what we need to address in order to assure that we can address corruption. These corrupt actors also weaken democratic governance. The United States will continue to use all available tools to break the links between criminal activity and corruption, including through sanctions. Sanctions and other tools help support our U.S. Strategy on corruption, and I think they act as a signal to the rest of the world. The United States is committed to exposing corruption, and will do it whenever we see it, and promoting accountability for corrupt acts worldwide. We won't be shy about it. We will continue to use our tools to protect the financial system in our own interests, as well as yours. And democratic institutions need to be protected from the abuse of corrupt actors. So in closing, let me call on all politicians, you, Prime Minister, and your entire team, as well as all the citizens here and beyond, to use your diverse backgrounds to unite in the fight against corruption. We can shape a future where Montenegro emerges as a strong, respected member of the European Union, even as it is already a steadfast member of NATO. And I'm proud of you to have you as my ally. Thank you again to Mons, and good luck with this conference.
For reminding us that civil society is criticizing or wanting to improve the processes, and not just because of the sake of criticism. So I would like to ask the ambassador of the UK to address us. And I'm especially pleased since we have the opportunity to hear a bit more about certain areas that this state has been focusing on for years when it comes to the reforms in Montenegro. Esteemed Prime Minister, dear colleagues, ambassadors, dear Vanja, dear guests.
I'm back to English. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part in the opening of the 17th Months Conference Against Corruption. Corruption is a really easy topic to discuss. It's uncontroversial. Everybody opposes it, nobody defends it, and any criticism of it resonates with every audience. We all know we've got to fight it, but despite this, all the efforts to tackle corruption, it endures over time and it endures over geography. So as my colleagues have said already, no country is completely free from corruption. Obviously, that doesn't mean to fight it is pointless, but we do have to acknowledge it's a very difficult and a thankless task. Prosecutors live under constant threat, journalists are attacked, and civil society leaders endure smear campaigns. This conference is an opportunity to acknowledge the efforts of those who take on these challenges, the challenges of fighting corruption, and for us to acknowledge that we must continue to do so and we must continue to support them, because without their efforts, this country, Montenegro, and other countries, so Montenegro cannot become a place where young people stay, where they build futures based on merit. It cannot attract investment, it cannot sustain growth, or achieve the European standards of living that come with EU membership if it does not fight corruption. And it was very good, Prime Minister, to hear how much you had to say about the efforts the government is making, because these are key. But as I said, no country is free from corruption. And because of this, it makes fighting corruption something all countries can unite behind. And the UK, as with other countries and international organizations, we're finding our way to work to support Montenegro, to build institutions, to build robust practices, to tackle the issues that we will discuss today. So, you know, the financing of political parties and electoral reform are key, frankly, to what needs to be done. So This conference is about addressing the issues, and I commend MANS for their continued commitment to this cause, to making us face up to issues we all have to address at a sort of macro and a micro level, and for organising such a valuable programme. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, Her Excellency Ambassador France, she will address as our partner and EU member state, from whose support also depends the process of European integrations of Montenegro. So please take the floor.
Hvala puno, dear Prime Minister, dear Director, dear Minister, dear colleagues, participants. Basically, everything has been said already before me, so I'm only going to repeat things, but repetition has pedagogical virtues, so I think you'll all agree with this. But first of all, let me allow me to extend my deepest thanks to MANS for organizing this conference, 17th in a row, substantive conference. But above all, thank you and your team for your tireless work on the ground all year round. And this is really important. On this International Anti-Corruption Day, there is no denying that we collectively, as has been heard already, still have much work to do. We all remain faced with the challenges related to corruption to varying degrees, depending notably on the maturity of our country's rule of law framework, but still. As you have already heard, corruption undermines the foundation of our democracies, economic and social development, environmental protection. It causes a lack of confidence between citizens and their state. And France, as a country, is acutely aware of these challenges and works on them both internally and as part of its foreign policy. As an example of this work still in progress in the French administrations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has just unveiled and adopted today a brand new roadmap for their own employees, its agents, on the subject of integrity. And concerning its international action, France is active both bilaterally and within multilateral bodies to contribute to setting ambitious standards and making sure that they are enforced. And we have three main focuses in this framework. The first one is the role of civil society with a view to better taking into account their expertise and also the protection of whistleblowers. Second focus is the gender dimension of the fight against corruption. Corruption impacts men and women differently, we know this. And in 2019, France adopted a feminist diplomacy, making women's rights and gender equality a priority in its external action. And the international action of France on the fight against corruption benefited from this new viewpoint. And the third focus is the impact of corruption on sustainable development and the environment. Corrupt practices in the environment sector always encourage environmental crime and ultimately lead to the degradation of natural resources with dire potential economic and development consequences for the countries concerned. In Montenegro, France's partnership with all relevant stakeholders, be they public institutions or members of the civil society, and again, big shout out to MANS here. So the partnership of France also revolves around those three axes I just mentioned. We have provided some specific expertise over the past few months so that Montenegro can build its own robust framework to fight corruption, establish the necessary system to combat eco-crime, and ultimately ensure that all its citizens benefit from the rule of law in accordance with the country's commitment to its EU path. And we're, of course, not there yet. And I'm not referring to Montenegro alone. The collective effort must definitely be kept up as everywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, Excellency, at the very end, now I would like to hear the Italian ambassador to Italy is the state which is well known for its fight against mafia and organized crime. We hope that Montenegro one day will reach that point. I think that we can learn a lot from that state, and I think that all of you in this room very well know how persistently we advocated for the so-called Italian model when it comes to seizure of proceeds of crime. So it's a great pleasure to ask Her Excellency Ambassador to Italy to address us.
Thank you very much. And Marie, don't complain, because can you imagine how difficult it is being the last one? Anyway, thank you so much, dear Prime Minister. It's a pleasure to have you here. First of all, as the others were saying, a big praise and congratulations to Mans, because we are at the 17th edition, and that means a lot, of course, of this important event. As it has been already pointed out, Italy has had a long story of fighting against corruption at different levels, in the political domain, in the public administration sector, in the private sector, and also in the links that normally are happening between the private and public endeavors. And all these experience made us quite good in fighting corruption. And indeed, now our example is a model at international level. And we are absolutely ready to share our experience and our expertise, and to see whether this model can be applied also in other countries. First of all, here in Montenegro, because both the president and also the prime minister asked us to help the country to set up here an institution like our Guardia di Finanza. And because of this request, in March, we had a high-level mission of the Guardia di Finanza here, who had very high-level meetings also with the prime minister and other authorities. And in order to understand the context, the Montenegrin context, and also to understand the request and what is applicable here in Montenegro. And this visit is already bearing some fruits, because now we have organizing already some training course for Montenegrin policemen in different domains that actually I've already mentioned here as very important also for the government. That is the fight against money laundering, the fight against organized crime, and also the link between tax and crimes, because, I mean, as the Prime Minister mentioned and as other interlocutor mentioned, there is a link between tax payment or not payment of tax and crime at different levels. But in a more perspectival view, and answering the request from the Montenegrin side to have also here in Montenegro something like our Guardia di Finanza, after the visit that we had in March, the Guardia di Finanza in Rome is preparing a document that I hope I will be able to share with you very soon, a document in which we are giving some suggestion on how here in Montenegro a Guardia di Finanza could look like, how many people could be involved, what kind of legal framework you will need in order to have this sort of institution to be able to function, and what kind of crimes it can tackle. It's not easy, of course. I mean, I just want to remind you that our Italian Guardia di Finanza this year is celebrating its 250th anniversary. So Rome was not built in a day, and not even Guardia di Finanza was built in a day. But there are for sure things that in the meantime Montenegro can do, and it could, of course, have all our help and support, and is to create the condition to have once Guardia di Finanza operating here. And when I talk about the condition, I talk also about the legal framework. That is the most important thing. But let me make a final comment based on what has been already said, of course, because I'm the last one to talk, so that we are pretty normal. But let me stress it one more time, because, you know, there's many things that a country can do in order to fight against corruption. You can create a specific entity, a specific institution, a specific police force. You can, of course, prepare the legal framework. You can detect different kind of crime, updating your criminal code to insert also the economic and financial crimes. You can train or have trained policemen, judge, prosecutor, public officials, whatever, and so on and so forth. But all of that may not be enough if at the same time you don't have also a culture of legality that is established in the country. And the top-down approach that when you are fighting against corruption is absolutely needed, alone may not be enough. It needs to be accompanied also by a bottom-up approach. Basically, is people, normal citizen, the society who should stigmatize corruption, should not accept anybody who asks for a bribe. And this is absolutely very important because it would create a domain in which people not only denounce an act of corruption, but also stigmatize that in the society. The Prime Minister has mentioned in different occasions after his visit to Singapore, the model of Singapore for many different, in many different domains. And actually, I've been told by a colleague of mine when I was in Myanmar from Singapore, she said to me, you know, in my country, corruption is so bad, is seen such so horrible crime that if a public official or a politician is found to be corrupted, normally he commits suicide because he cannot bear the kind of shame and the stigma that corruption is giving. Of course, we don't want anybody to commit suicide, and we are not asking for that. But this kind of culture of legality, I think is absolutely very important. And also this culture of legality is something that takes time to be established. So the sooner any country starts to do that, the better. Many thanks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Okay. It's very difficult to say what I have after all of you, but I will try to do this in a way which is maybe a bit more direct, because our international partners, to whom I'm very grateful for attending this conference today and participating at the previous conferences, are much more courteous towards decision makers than I was and than I am usually. And I usually say for myself that if there is a job that I could never do, this is definitely diplomacy. I would not be too successful in it, but the job that I'm doing my whole life, as you all know, is scanning of this system, for which I'm trying to understand together with my colleagues what's wrong with it, what is so rotten within it, so that it enables some individuals to abuse and use the state laws and their positions for their personal interest and gain, and that such a small number of citizens that we have in Montenegro, such a small population, lives so poorly, they cannot have even the fundamental rights, some basic things and needs, such as the issue whether a family member can get the surgery if they don't have the money, whether a child can enroll a certain school if they are not a representative adequate for our VIP class. So these small things which mean life to each of the citizens, then up to the key strategic decisions adopted by the state, the corruption has entered each pore of this whole system and completely deformed it. And what we see on the surface, this image, this photography of the system, it has no relation with what is hiding behind the surface, with the rot caused by the corruption. We frequently call this captured state. We spoke about captured state when absolutely no one was ready to admit that this problem exists in Montenegro. But if we speak about capturing the states and the institutions and the interests of individuals, what did we do for these 4 years to uncapture this system? What are we going to do in the upcoming period to prevent this system from being abused by those in power and who will be in power in the future? Because if you have the system where corruption is a rule and legal behavior is an exception, then it's difficult to expect that each individual appointed by the new government will be ethical enough and have enough integrity and morals to say no and to choose public interest, especially if there are no consequences. And still there are no consequences, not for what was happening and for what is happening now. And based on this detailed and sometimes painful and difficult for us analysis of the analyzing of the system and unearthing certain concrete cases, which were not important only because these are concrete cases or because they included the names of the highest public officials and most powerful people in Montenegro, but because these concrete cases pointed to a system level omissions within the system and gaps, we thought that it was not valuable to sacrifice our own life for a better future. But we thought that we finally came to this moment because political change was a requirement, a prerequisite for elementary political will. But we see that this requirement is not the only requirement, not enough, because were it enough, we would not be talking about many of these things, from party-related employment, which is the most banal and most visible form of corruption. This is like sticking a finger in somebody's eye. It's as if you stick a finger into the eye of each voter who voted for you, who fought for you, because these citizens understand this very well. Maybe the citizens do not understand complex laws, analysis, public policies, but citizens understand party-related employment. Nobody needs to explain this to them. And this is the hope that is being lost, and we need it in order to achieve what our most important partners talked about, and this is the resilience of a society to corruption and the relation towards corrupt human resources, because they need to be treated as what they are, as criminals and not highly esteemed businessmen, politicians, or whatever. They should be seen as rejects from the society. People should find them abominable and not to look up to them as examples of behavior, and to teach the upcoming generation that it is important to have cash, to have connections, to have party, watching over your back, and not knowledge, integrity, and courage. And I will never accept what I hear frequently, that this is part of the mentality of Montenegrins. It's not true. It's not part of our mentality to be corrupt. Our mentality is to help friends, relatives, but not to charge them for this, and not to take the money from others, or not to allow somebody to have surgery because they are not a member of our party or they do not come from our village, because we know how proud we are of our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, because they had integrity, courage when times were much more difficult than today, much more difficult. And this is why we can do this if we want to do this. And this government can do this. This government can do this. This prime minister can do this because he has the majority and never before seen in the history, at least as far as I can remember, all SMP and DPS, when they were together in the 1990s, maybe they were more powerful, but in the recent democratic past, he has large majority which could enable Montenegro to change from the very roots of itself. And primarily, the first thing that we need to fight against if we want to change Montenegro from its root is the proceeds of crime. First of all, because these proceeds are still being used to destabilize the system, to buy the decision makers, to recruit the experts who assist them in hiding the money, to avoid justice, including experts, lawyers, specialized or mocking our system in order to keep the criminals on this side of the prison bars. We need to confiscate these assets because it has been illegally gained and enables them to stay out of prisons, and also because this would send a message. This sends a message that corruption pays. So this message needs to be sent that this state will not tolerate to anyone, no matter to which party or clan they belong to, or to which religious structure of the society. This state will not tolerate illegal wealth, first of all, of its public officials. And we need to speak more about that, about criminalization of illegal wealth of political officials. We are not talking about this since the downfall of DPS. So there are still officials in other parties who would like to get rich illegally, especially if they see that they will not suffer any consequences. So show a goodwill that you will limit yourselves and that you want to prevent that your members of your governments will become corrupt. Nobody is stopping you to do this. Now you have the necessary majority. I'm very pleased that today we heard from the Prime Minister that he was speaking about corruption, that he speaks about corruption, and then also other areas. But it's clear to me that the political priority of your political party and your government was economic recovery and meeting some requirements. But if the citizens do not have elementary conditions for a dignified life, then they will just wait for an opportunity to flee to the EU. And the problems will multiply here because those who are most able, most capable will leave, and what will remain in a country is our goal for the best ones to leave to work in Belgium, France, Germany for a higher salary than what Europe now too offers. Now the goal is to keep them, to build this country, to give a future and a hope to the people, a hope to the upcoming generations, who is not just, okay, you will go to the EU to work as a nurse or whatever, even the best job, but you will not be working in your country, and only us, only we can protect the country from those who want to pocket the country as a whole, no matter from which party they are coming from. And if you want to do this, we can turn a blind eye, but we all know all too well that with these kinds of institutions, with this policy, with this persecution, with this judiciary, this will not happen. This will definitely not happen. And if we don't change this, we cannot bring the faith of the people to justice. We see how these important proceedings look like, for which some people, first of all, the special state prosecutor, they risk their lives in order to start them. And how do they look now? They look like a farce. This parliamentary majority and the government has the power to change this. They have the power and they have the roadmap. They have the knowledge of many experts from many countries who tried to do this. We talk talked about this roadmap introduction of the special court, where you will have only judges who are proven not to have any connections with the organized crime, and not judges who are hiding business connections with criminal structures, who are not reporting their own property, etc. So we expect that this government will show through concrete examples that there is political will, which is not a question of fulfilling, just ticking the boxes for Brussels' sake. This is important, but according to my opinion, it's even more important from entering the EU to achieve such a standard that once we do enter, our youth will not want to leave this country. They will want to stay here and build this state. When we speak about the priorities, the first and fundamental thing that you will learn when you start dealing with combating corruption is that prevention is important. It's better to prevent than to treat. This is what we heard many times, even in the elementary school. For prevention, the key thing is transparency. If you have darkness, and if the doors are closed, and if the decisions are being made in a non-transparent way, you cannot prevent corruption. This is why we are talking so much about this law on free access to information, which is finalized, but it just waits since the end of 2020, which was sent to the parliament and 3 times sent back with different excuses, and it's still not adopted, not only because this is the main tool for unearthing the cases of corruption, but also because a public official, when they decide on something and if they know that the document that they are signing can become a public document, they will take care about those who he or she knows that they will just put them in a drawer, never to be seen again. So this is why this law is so important, the law on financing of political parties. And we heard about them from their excellencies and also from the EU. Is not only an issue of showing that you are able to find a minimal agreement between the political structures regarding the implementation of the reform. This is actually the essence of democracy, because if you enable someone to come to power by financing him or her by using dirty money, no matter whether this is result they came from crime or any other illegal entity or some other state, if you enable them to come to power thanks to this type of financing, the corruption will be inbuilt into the foundations of the system, infused in it, because somebody gave you money in order to repay him back, and not so you'll be looking at the interest of those people, not the interest of citizens. It doesn't matter to whom this dirty money belongs to. The important thing is the interest. If it's not the interest of those who voted for these politicians, those who live in this country, who want this country to be better, this is why this law is the key. But I don't want to be misunderstood. The law, which maybe will find somebody with 20,000 euros because they are behaving as they are behaving. This is provisory. When it comes to financing of political parties and elections, we are speaking about millions and millions invested in these affairs. You have the recognition of people connected with criminal structures. You have evidence provided by our partners, first of all, from the NATO states, but no results. And if we allow the system to be corrupt from its roots, what kind of results can we expect? This is why it's important to show that we as a society are ready and mature enough to finally start cleansing political parties from criminal influences, no matter from which spheres they are coming from. And at the very end, I don't want to spread this story for too long, but I need to add 2 more things. First of all, according to my opinion, the port of Bar has hotspots or dark spots black spot when it comes to organized crime in Montenegro, not only in order to see what is happening in it, but also in order to not allow criminalization of the new authorities, new government, because we are speaking about such huge amounts of money that the support that we are getting from the EU and our Western partners is so small in relation to the lucrative benefits and profits that organized crime structures related to political structures have only from the port of Bar, only in one case, actually in two cases, related to one criminal group during 1 year, only for cigarette smuggling, so no cocaine, no other things. Only what the prosecution is processing for this criminal group is our goods worth 500 million euros, just cigarettes, just 1 year, just what the prosecution knows for a single organized criminal group. So we are speaking about structures that have such financial power that it's more than what Montenegro has, such financial power. So we need such a courageous prime minister who will dare to combat these structures, and we have huge expectations from Mr. Spajić in regard of this. And I will wrap up by saying that during all of these years, we're ready and we wanted to cooperate with the institutions of the system. Well, in these institutions, there was an elementary readiness to be heard and to implement some reforms, not to be just a pretty thing and to implement any kind of reform. But we are ready even today. Maybe they are not the best solutions, have solutions. We want to help and to give a maximum contribution to this and every subsequent government when it comes to combating corruption, to put this issue on the top of the agenda, because only in that way they will ensure that the citizens feel justice. It's a great pleasure that today with us we will have experts from all of these countries, and additionally some other countries, to hear from them the good and the bad experiences on the road that they've gone through, and to try to have concrete results from this conference, to not to have just one of those events where we meet, we talk, maybe do a situation assessment compared to the previous year. We want to have something concrete. So for the very start, the Prime Minister spoke about combating corruption and what he thinks are the priorities. And we, as previous times, we will note this down and then we will see whether this has been achieved, but we also expect a more ambitious agenda and braver reforms, more serious reforms, and indicators of political will. Thank you once again. Sorry for maybe speaking for too long. I would like to thank to my team who has tried hard with this conference, and also to our donors for financial and any other form of assistance. Thank you. Now, short break.
On the panel where we are going to hear, at which we are going to hear our international experts. This is the 17th year that we have conferences, a conference like this. 5 years since big changes that we were looking forward to took place, but not a big deal about that. It seems you heard lots of panelists before, them whose advice is given, but ends up in some tunnel. We need grit. And we need steadfastness this time. Let's listen to recommendations and let's keep a close eye as to whether we follow them here. First, we have Mr. Professor Dr. Michael Koss, head of the Professorship on Political System in Germany. How do you see the fact that there are no changes taking place here? You've been panelist yourself here for many years. How do you look upon this, and what would your recommendation be?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really wish to keep it brief and talk you through the few general findings in the literature on political finance I at least could find. And there is one trend which, in my reading, affects all European democracies, old and new, so to speak. And this is the decreasing level of donations and also membership dues, and the increasing level of state funding to political parties or candidates. Since the 1990s, one could almost say that state funding has replaced donations when it comes to parties or candidates' income. And this has been associated, this trend has been associated with a sequence of what I would like to call error, which is the perception of political corruption or the existence of political corruption, and trial to reform the rules of the game of party or campaign finance. And this, well, the problem, I guess, and the reason we are here to discuss what to do about party funding is that this chain of error and trial has also been associated with decreasing levels of democratic legitimacy, be it because there are cases of political corruption, or be it because there is the perception of political corruption. This, when it comes to democratic legitimacy, this has the very same consequence, a bad one. And this, of course, is what needs to be tackled, at least in my understanding. The good news is that it's relatively easy to identify what is to be done. The bad news, of course, is that it's difficult to perform the reforms necessary. Let me talk you through it. Because, you know, when it comes to research, the origins of party funding regimes, that I should add that, the origins of party funding regimes, their consequences are so difficult to disentangle from other causal factors, societal change, institutional design of democracies, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to what to do about this decreasing levels of legitimacy, I would argue it's relatively easy because it's donations which are the problem. At the end of the day, even small and large one, but I would like to confine myself to large donations here because they are, for at least in my understanding, obvious reasons, the larger problem. Because donations do increase existing levels of political, societal, and cultural inequality. And this is why, why they are so closely associated with bad perceptions of politics, to be more precise, decreasing levels of legitimacy. And this is why I argue donations need to be replaced by other forms of parties' income, or abolished altogether, but that might be a step too far in my understanding, because, well, the money needs to come from somewhere, and this exclusive reliance of political parties or candidates on state funding is also something I would not argue for. But large donations in particular need to be abolished. Caps on donations, not only transparency. That would be my recommendation, because transparency, so to speak, exclusively exposes the problem, but does not at all solve it. And this is maybe something, at least I myself and many of my colleagues and many practitioners as well, wished to believe in the previous years, that transparency alone is a solution, but it's not, in my understanding. That's why there need to be caps on donations. The influence of private money on political finance needs to be limited. And this, of course, requires, at the end of the day, effective control and sanctioning mechanisms. And this, at the very latest, is where the big problem begins, because the question then arises how to introduce and stabilize effective control of political finance. And here, I'm afraid there will most likely be yet another sequence of trial and error, I'm afraid. I leave it to that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for the time being.
Thank you so much. I suggest we continue as we saw the Prime Minister who spoke at length and didn't stick to the scheduled time. Now we hear from Ivan Briscoe, Senior Director for Policy from International Crisis.
Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to talk primarily about the role of organized crime and its influence on politics, on political parties, and elections, and how to maybe control that influence. I'll be talking about different regions of the world, but one in particular, which is the one I know best and has been the greatest interest to me, which is Latin America. I work at International Crisis Group, which is an NGO devoted to conflict resolution and mitigation. And I was for 8 years director for Latin America. So I know the cases very well. And it's also the region perhaps with the greatest track record in handling the criminal threat over democracies. That's not something we'd wish to advertise, but it is an unfortunate reality. Our organized criminal influence on democratic political life is, if you like, a subset of corruption in general. Corruption, if you like, is the misuse of public office for private ends. But the organized criminal influence is it's a particular variety of that, which is the misuse of office by officials for private ends, but those private ends being the interests of organized criminal groups pursuing their own illicit activities. And obviously, when we talk about this organized criminal influence, we were talking about officials giving permissions which they shouldn't do for organized criminal activity. We're talking very importantly about the provision of judicial impunity, so immunity to prosecution, protection from prosecution, special privileges within the judicial system. We're talking about joint ventures between organized criminal groups and state officials, joint profit-making ventures. We're talking about preferential access, perhaps to public works contracts, to groups that also are involved in other criminal activities, whether it's extortion, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's all forms of illegal activities such as illegal mining, human trafficking, cigarette smuggling. The list goes on. There are many different varieties, but we're not talking particularly just about corruption. But I think when we consider the effects of organized criminal influence in public life, they are important, and they are various. Obviously, one of the most important is the entrenchment of crime in political life. And this is what we see in Mexico, for example, in the local municipal public activities in certain parts of Mexico where the influence of organized crime is notorious, in Central America as well. We're also talking, obviously, about parts of other regions as well. I'll come to deal with that a little bit later. Organized crime, or rather the reaction to the perception of organized crimes activities in democracies, can also drive political upheaval. And we saw that in the country, Central American country of Guatemala, just a decade ago, when a case involving the president in a perceived criminal racket drove a huge wave of protests, which eventually led to the resignation and indictment and imprisonment of that president. And similar cases have been reported. Of course, you might say something similar about Ukraine in 2013 with the movement against the president Yanukovych in that moment, and also in other cases as well. the perception of crime is often an explosive element within democracies. It generates great indignation. But there's the third element as well, which is slightly more difficult to trace, but is becoming an evident risk, which is organized crime creating political outcomes to its liking, particularly at the national level. It's difficult to find a case in which we can say for certain that organized crime has played a key role in achieving a political goal at the national level. But when we look at the rise of anti-incumbent candidates making use of social media campaigns, making use, for example, of TikTok, using small budgets, targeted disinformation, or campaigns which harness discontent, then there seem to be openings for criminal collusion. Whether that's relatively low level or high level is a matter which is difficult to pin down. But I just point to the case of the presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2018. Although he wasn't driven by crime, and it's obviously, I won't want to get into the issue of whether he was a criminal himself, he did have some indirect alliances or connections, at the very least, with certain militia groups operating criminal rackets in Rio de Janeiro. And these sorts of openings may be easier in a context when a candidate is less well known, less established, and maybe has come from a background in which those alliances can take place. I think it's very interesting when you're talking about these different political effects to consider three countries, which I studied when I was carrying out a study looking particularly at organized criminal influence on parties and elections 8 years ago. There were three countries where this seemed to be particularly important and worthwhile. And we looked at Mali in Africa, Mexico, obviously, and Georgia in the Caucasus. Each of those countries, in different ways, has undergone huge political change since we were looking at them in 2015. And I don't want to say that organized criminal influence in political life was the fundamental reason for their change, but it was no doubt a contributing factor. In Mali, which has been where the liberal democracy, if you like, was overturned through a couple of military coups, and a military-led regime is now in power with no election in sight, clearly discontent with democracy was very high. The new regime which took power, the new military regime, captured that discontent with democracy and has done very well to maintain a level of popularity as a result. In Mexico, we've seen a president come to power in 2018 who promised to clear away the corruption in the Mexican system. His famous comment he made was that if you're going to clean corruption, you do it like someone sweeping the stairs. You start from the top down. And that was his idea, that there'd be a new start for Mexico. But of course, he's a populist. He was a populist as well. And he's been closing down a number in his last year of his presidency, leading an effort to close down a series of checks and balances and autonomous institutions and undermining the judiciary as well, which is one of those concerns which can happen in Georgia. Obviously, we've seen move away from the EU project under the influence of, potentially, arguably, the influence of Russia. So this shows that organized crime is close to changing political reality in a number of cases. But very briefly, what I'm going to do is just talk about how we situate the organized criminal influence, where organized crime plays its influence, and if there's time, a few ideas for how to address the threat. So how should we understand the way organized crime is infiltrating, if you like, democratic political life? Obviously, the first point is that there is a crisis of liberal democracy. There's a crisis of democratic representation, which has lots of complex roots, but we're seeing in established democracies and recently emerging democracies, much of them due to the perceived failure of democratic institutions to address the needs and demands of the people. I can't go into that now, but that's clearly an issue which is resonant across much of the world. connected with this, I believe, is the distinction which we see very much in low-income, unequal societies where democracy has taken root, the disconnect between formal democratic practice and informal democratic practice, between what the protocols, procedures of democracy say are the ways to gain power and hand over power, and the way politics is actually practiced on the ground, whether it's through patron-client networks, through systems of benefactors, through established local leaderships, which are not necessarily democratic in nature. And what we tend to see in these contexts is party systems, political parties, not being programmatic, not being ideological, not grouping together necessarily classes or ethnicities even, but basically being paper-thin institutions which are based around personal leaderships and which allow for all sorts of transactions to take place. This is happening, for example, in Latin America, in the cases of Guatemala and Peru. Parties are created. They will look for local figures to incorporate for elections, and they will bring people together who don't have much in common, but in the hope of winning an election, of sending a certain number of deputies to parliament, of accumulating power, but with very little holding the party together. The party is there on paper, but in reality, there's nothing much going on. And this brings us to another point about modern democracies, which is the role of money, which the previous speaker has also spoken about. Money itself in politics raises worries, even if it's legitimate, even if it's lawful. It raises concerns about what are the quid pro quos. What does the donor get out of donating to a political party? But when we're thinking about organized crime, we're also thinking about that money which goes under the table, which is not declared, but which can have extreme influence. And what we do find is, particularly in emerging democracies, recently established democracies, and I found this doing work in Mali 8 or 9 years ago, was the amount of money which was being spent in elections and which was being undeclared by candidates was extraordinary. And obviously a lot of this was in cash. It was very difficult to trace, but it had a very significant influence. Why? Because political loyalties were not great. Parties were not able to mobilize lots of loyal support. And so in these democracies where there are no great loyalties, no great attachments, money can play a very significant role. And that opens the door to cash movements, which organized crime can take advantage of. Another point, and a very important one, and particularly relevant to Latin America, is the way democracies, democratic states have developed. Often they have brought a decentralization of power. They have introduced checks and balances, a stronger judiciary, autonomous institutions of oversight, new municipal powers or regional powers. And these are obviously great advances. They are moves away from the authoritarian state structures which used to rule the countries. But the problem is that organized crime can take advantage of these decentralized structures and pick off parts of them for its own particular interests. Now, this is something I see obviously very strongly in the case of Mexico. Since its transition to democracy in the 1990s. I can't say for certain that this is the same in other regions of the world, but it's obviously a high risk when you no longer have that vertical authority of an authoritarian state, that organized crime, if it is growing wealthier, if its rackets are becoming more lucrative, if, for example, drug trafficking, which is one of the most lucrative rackets crime can get involved in, is growing, then if at the same time democratization is taking place and the authorities are becoming more atomized and fragmented, then crime can pick off those parts which it needs to do, which is exactly what happened in Mexico. To a degree, organized crime lost a degree of interest in the central state, federal state, not entirely, and then concentrated at the lowest levels of power, the municipalities, the mayors, the city halls, the town halls, which controlled permits for business operations, which controlled the local municipal police forces, which had obviously influence over local prosecutors and local judges. By controlling those areas, then, of course, they were able to operate at those in those local territories. And it's a terrible thing that we've seen in Mexico, 220 mayors and local councillors killed since 2006 as a result of this focus on the local space of territorial power. So this brings me quickly to the issue of where does crime intersect, if you like, with politics in practice? The context I've described is one in which crime finds various avenues to explore. But what actually are there? Well, just to bring together a little bit of what I was saying, I think the first one is patronage. People in certain emerging democracies are accustomed to patronage relations, and organized crime captures this expectation and turns it around for its benefit. It doesn't so much just coerce local communities, it becomes, if you like, a legitimate authority within those communities through patronage. One very clear example we have seen in recent years is the development of a large criminal drug trafficking network in the north of Colombia called the Gulf Clan. It's probably the most important criminal group now in Colombia, and obviously commands the routes of export of a large amount of cocaine from that country. But when it takes control of local communities, it does so by providing Christmas gifts for children, jobs for local people. It has become described as the employer of last resort. It's somewhere you can go to get a job, this local criminal group. It aids, local infrastructure, schools and hospitals. And once it performs this role, it obviously gains a degree of support or consent from the locals. But this role is something which people are used to, because this is what politicians have traditionally done in those areas. So patronage networks, crime can obviously take over those. A second area is violent political entrepreneurs. Organized crime can play an important role in controlling blocks of voters, constituencies, if you like, by maintaining control over them and ensuring that they are the only ones who can give access to those communities for other politicians. So, if you like, the violence of criminal groups allows them to act as intermediaries between voters and official politicians. And this gives them a great role. And we've seen this particularly in the Caribbean, in Haiti and Jamaica. For example, Haiti, alas, has seen these gangs, which have long mediated, if you like, between very poor communities and political parties, acting obviously in the interests of political parties, has seen these gangs grow as a result of an ongoing political turmoil to become, to have turned into Frankensteins, if you like, exacting a terrible price from local people through kidnappings, through extortion, through other sorts of rackets, and effectively becoming a challenger to the government itself. As I said, a third area of influence, and a very important one, are through local authorities. The failure to control what happens at the local arena, the municipalities, is one of the great weaknesses in politics, in democratic politics in Latin America. And you see this as well in the African cases. Central states, to a degree, are better at protecting themselves from criminal influences, but local authorities are less so. But that is not altogether the case, because we do see at the central state level still some of the influence of organized crime, whether it's through election spending directly to political parties, whether it's through communicating with central government through deputies, parliamentarians elected from corrupted localities. And this is a particular influence you see in, for example, in Brazil, or again in Mexico and in Colombia, that deputies, representatives elected from areas where organized criminal groups are strong, then have power in the central state. And you also see this in countries where democracy has been corroded, where there are authoritarian takeovers of democracy. And governments which are perhaps not entirely able to control their populations look to criminal groups as a form of partner in generating extra revenue and as enabling them to support the policing of local populations. And this is something which we have seen in Venezuela, where alliances between the central state, which is becoming ever more authoritarian, and local criminal groups is very important in generating the revenues to pay off the military, which are essential to the survival of that state. So these are the various forms of interaction. I'm going to end very briefly just by pointing to a few areas where I think progress can be made and caveats with regard to that progress. I think it's essential to understand networks. Everything which I've described is about the connections between formal politicians, informal politicians, people operating in that space, which is all to do with the political mobilization and the development of coalitions, often at the local level, but which is not in the formal area of political parties and officialdom and the state, if you like, and crime. So those sorts of networks are very important to understand. And crime itself is not just about people who are violent mobsters. It also involves a large spectrum of people who will be often connected to formal business as well. So understanding those networks, which are becoming ever more complex and disaggregated in advanced criminal economies, is extremely important. Secondly, prosecution and investigation can be made more effective. And Latin America has done a great job at this over the last 2 decades. And you can look into the development of wiretaps, telephone interceptions, for example, looking at the development of high-risk courts, so courts where there are special security perimeters, if you like, to try extremely delicate cases. But one initiative in particular was terribly important, and that's what was called in parts of Latin America effective collaboration. It's ensuring the negotiations can take place between an investigating judge and a witness, someone involved in a criminal operation, so actually a suspect, and enabling that judge to offer lower sentences in exchange for information regarding the broader criminal activity, and particularly the bosses of that criminal activity. Those innovations, whether in Brazil, whether in Guatemala, whether in Colombia, have been crucial to breaking up some of the larger criminal operations. I think you can look at political party reforms. You can look at changing or trying to encourage internal party democracy and disciplining parties if some of their members are found to have had links to organized crime, although there are certain undesired consequences of these reforms, but they have produced certain progress in areas. But lastly, I would just say, overall, I think the message which comes across, if you look at democracies in Latin America or Africa or Asia, is to have a realistic assessment of what can be done. Obviously, it's very important to control the flow of dirty money into politics, to control criminal influence over politics and therefore over elected officials. But you have to do so acknowledging the capacities of the states in question. I must admit, 10 years ago, now Mali is effectively under a military regime. 10 years ago, it was a competitive democracy, but it was quite tragic to actually go to the offices which were in charge with controlling the corruption or the flow of illicit money in the country and in politics more narrowly, and see how weak they were, how little they could do, how little support they had, and yet at the same time, how much money was being spent by politicians in their different campaigns, and how important getting that money back from the state was to the elected politicians, and thus the effect on the perceptions of Malians of what democracy involved. Understanding those different bits, putting them together, and making sure that you have institutions that can actually defend democratic values in practice is extremely important. And I think rather than just shouting of the importance of democracy, in all cases, we must understand what it actually means to the people on the ground and how they perceive it. And how they perceive the role of crime is terribly important for the way they think their democracies are operating and the success, democratic success in their countries. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Vildan Plepi, Deputy Director of NGI Albania. Welcome. You are the only one who is physically present here, so you may take the floor.
Briefly, just an introduction about myself. So my name is Vildan Plepi. I represent NDI office in Albania here. For those of you who don't know, NDI is an international organization with a headquarters in Washington, D.C., but with presence in over 70 countries around the world, with a mission of advancing democracy, and we do that through working with political parties and parliaments and civil society and so on and so forth. So it is my really distinct pleasure to be here today. My presentation has a slightly different, let's say, approach, which is a more of a practical approach, because I thought that maybe today would be best if I come here and share some of the lessons learned from Albania's path towards strengthening party and election finance over the last maybe 10 years or so. And I want to speak to that to, let's say, three main sort of components to this. At NDI, we certainly emphasize a lot the process through which the legislation is drafted, because I think this is really important. And then also, obviously, when you speak about areas such as party and election finance, you want to make sure that the enforcement agency has all the capacities and the legal framework, and also that there is political will that things are tackled in the right way. Anyway, just for a start, so we need to acknowledge that party and election finance, compared to other areas of the elections, is relatively newly regulated. So it's about 30 to 40 years that countries around the world have instituted party and election regulations within their own legislations, all of them obviously in different ways. But this comes also with some, we live in a digital era. It means we are facing challenges that we didn't face 20, 30, or 40 years ago when we started regulating party and election finance. And these are things that we need to take into account as we speak about how do we want to regulate this. So there is a lot of discussion nowadays about the AI role in the election campaigns, and mostly so on the online media and social media. We know that social media plays a huge part in the way how parties are running elections. If 10 or 15 or more years ago, social media played very little role, so parties were running the campaign in a very traditional way. I think nowadays that has changed quite a bit. But that also means that it's opening new paths for foreign countries, for example, to interfere in the elections for as long as we don't have any regulation that speaks to that. So, and just to keep in mind, no regulatory system is perfect, right? All countries obviously have their own way of how they regulate it. We can't say that this country is doing it really well and this other country is not really doing well. I think that, it needs a lot of discussion about how do we want to tackle that. So, first thing I want to talk to, and that's again based on our experience, is the process for introducing new legislation, and more specifically party and election finance legislation. What typically happens is that you have parties and experts coming forward with different proposals. So everybody's trying to offer something, obviously trying to contribute to the process. What I find is missing is that, we don't have like a strategic framework in place before starting, to regulate the laws. And I think this is highly important because, as I said, everybody is giving their own contribution, but we don't know what we want to achieve through this goal. So it's important through this law. So it's important to have some initial discussion in political level and share some goals about how do we want this law to look like? What are the issues that we are facing and what are the goals or objectives that we would want to accomplish? Once this is clear, then the mechanisms to accomplish those goals are a matter of discussion. But often, if I'm saying this and someone else is saying something else, I think we're ending up with laws that are not properly implementable or enforceable. So I think it's of utmost important that the process, okay, we all say, yes, we have to be inclusive, we need to discuss. But even before doing that, I think we first need to agree what are the goals of this legislation, because Montenegro's context is different from Albania's context, from Estonia's context, from France's context, and so on and so forth. So once we know what we want to achieve, then we can go into the next step. And then I'm referring here to the scope of the regulation, the sense of how broad, how far we need to go. We don't have to take every experience that some other country has been applying, which could have been excellent, perfect. It doesn't mean that it's going to work in Montenegro. That's why I said it's important to define what do we want to address and how broad our regulation should be. We don't need to over-regulate. We either don't need to regulate things that are not an issue, at least not yet. Okay? And the third point I want to make in my presentation is about the enforcement and sanctions. You can have the best law in the world with the best, let's say, standards, but for as long as those are not being enforced, which means if you don't have an agency that is able to enforce those laws, if you have a sanctioning regime that is weak, that is not dissuasive, then, as I said, those standards could be there in the law, but if they are not enforced, if the sanctions are not doing their job, I don't think we're going that far, okay? Now, again, based on experience, I did mention in the beginning, I want to offer a bit of, practical, sort of share some of the lessons through Albania's journey to regulate party and election finance. There is a lot of discussion nowadays, for example, in Albania about third parties or non-contestant campaigners. And I read from the documents that I was shared by my colleagues that it is also a recommendation for Montenegro to look into this area and sort of see what are the ways that you want to regulate that. And third-party regulation is important for at least two main reasons. One is that, first, we need to understand that the approach to how we regulate party and election finance cannot only be now seen as narrow as, okay, let's regulate parties and candidates. Campaigns nowadays are being affected quite a lot by what we call influencers, third parties, groups that are out there that we don't know who they are. I mean, we see that they have a voice in the campaign. We see that they're pouring money into the campaign, but our enforcement agencies have no regulation how to control and oversee them. So the question is who these groups are. Are maybe parties using these groups to circumvent campaign limits on spending? Or maybe are these groups backed up or supported by countries that have a particular interest in interfering in the elections and therefore in the outcome or the results of the elections? So I don't know how far the discussion about third-party regulation has gone in Montenegro, but it's certainly something that Albania is looking into, but we haven't yet regulated that. There has been a lot of discussion among political parties and experts and civil society, and we all recognize, because we do have evidence, Bern, for example, in Albania, did this monitoring of the social media. Only in the last 2023 elections, they noticed, only by Facebook reports, that more than $90,000 were being spent by third parties running election campaign via social media, and we don't know who they are. So that's an area that it's gaining more and more traction. Another thing that we haven't really been able to look into, and maybe we have overlooked that, is the self-financing of candidates. Our legislation has a great deal of regulation about what parties can use from their own sources to fund their own campaign. For some reason, the candidates are less regulated when it comes to this. So, for example, there is no limit to how much a certain candidate can give for his campaign. Obviously, that cannot be called a donation for the campaign. Donations are regulated, but the donation in itself means it's a transaction between two individuals. So if a candidate is funding his own or her own campaign, that cannot be classified as a donation, but it's a self-funding of the campaign, for which, as I said, We don't have any regulation. I'm not sure if your legislation is looking into that, but just to bring this up, and forward for discussion, that you should look also into regulating how candidates themselves are spending money, where the money are coming from, and so on and so forth. Social media, as I mentioned, is also an area that needs to be tackled. We have maybe little tradition in regulating social media. Our legislation mostly speaks to the traditional media, to the television, maybe newspapers, but not so much the social media. But a lot of these third-party campaigning is happening via the social media. And Facebook has made transparent through this Ask Library. And you can see, for example, who in Montenegro was spending money on election campaign. However, the level of transparency, I think it's missing there. So you can't really go that far. You can see some lump sums, and maybe you can see, let's say, the names of those groups on social media. But if you want to trace down where this is really coming from, I think it's a bit of a problem. And then we have the issue of the cryptocurrency donations, or maybe PayPal or other forms of donation to the political party, which are harder to track, because through bank accounts, it's easier, the traditional way, or cash records. But these more modern way of donating to political parties, I think, again, the legislation in this area has already looked upon, and it's a new challenge that we have to tackle and see. Okay. Yes, I mean, maybe this slide is a bit technical, might be willing to skip it, but again, I'm more than happy to provide further expertise, or as much as we can, when we discuss about third-party regulation, because third-party regulation is most probably one of the most difficult areas to regulate when it comes to party and election finance. It's easy to say, okay, there are some bans on donations, there are some ceiling on how much you can spend, and maybe there are provisions that would prevent conflict of interest from media, from companies who have received state funding, and so on and so forth. So those look pretty straightforward. But if we discuss about third-party regulation, we are entering into some constitutional rights of groups of people who want to contribute to the campaign. Therefore, I'm saying it's a bit difficult, and it does require a bit of discussion about how do we want to regulate that. If we speak about the regional context, actually, certainly third-party campaigning is not the same as what we see in the US or the UK. We have trade unions there that are very, very powerful, or other groups. And for example, UK's legislation is very clear when it comes to third-party regulation. So it does define who they are. It does set spending above which they should register with the UK's Electoral Commission. So it does set regulations also about reporting. They should report. There are limits also for these third parties, how much they can spend, where can they get the money from. So they're pretty much treated like an electoral contestant. I mean, they're not running for the elections, but the fact that they are pouring money into the campaign, and the fact that they are supporting a certain candidate or a party, it makes it obligatory to look upon where the money is coming from and who is standing behind. As I said, if we don't have them regulated, we are running into two risks. First, we are letting an open, avenue for parties to use third parties to circumvent spending limits, because they can channel the money through these groups and therefore still pretend to keep the spending threshold low. Or foreign powers, there you go. They have a great avenue to inject money in the campaign and try to affect the outcome of the elections, which I guess we don't want. Yes, foreign interference is another area that the party election finance need to tackle. I don't see that it is, developed almost at all, at least at regional level. So we don't have much of it that speaks to foreign interference in the elections. There are, for example, provisions that speak to banning of donations from foreign entities. It's not clear, though, there are no definitions about foreign entities. Who is considered, legally speaking, a foreign entity? We have the case of shell companies, right? We have, for example, companies whose headquarters are completely elsewhere, but they have branches just, all around maybe the region. So would they be considered a foreign entity, or they would be a a national domestic entity. So there are quite a lot of discussion going into that. Also, expenditures, for example, made from foreign entities are not regulated, at least in the Albania's case. We regulate, so we ban donations from foreign entities. We are not banning expenditures from foreign entities. And sometimes with the law, you have to be very explicit, very clear. You know, the interpretation then can vary. So you'd better be, careful in what we draft and what we offer. Yes, another important area, which was the third that I want to make, is the oversight authority or oversight body. If we don't have an oversight body that has clear legal competencies and strong ones, we obviously cannot expect that the oversight agency would be performing and doing I don't know what. And it's not just it's not just the legal framework. The agency has to have its own internal, operational, and strategic framework in how they're going to tackle party and election finance monitoring and oversight. And obviously, you need also to have political will to address this issue, which I think is a main factor, because we reckon that, all around the region, yes, we speak to independent institutions and how they should perform their role. However, we would not forget that still, political will is important when it comes to enforcement of the legislation. And it's good also to have it streamlined. I mean, I don't know, in Montenegro's case, maybe in Albania's case, is the Central Election Commission is the sole authority that oversees party and election finance. They would audit their reports. They would look into the campaign, the activities. They would also be monitoring the state institutions when they're conducting public activities. Maybe in Montenegro it's slightly different. I know it's an anti-corruption agency, but maybe it's also your state audit that looks into the report. So the recommendation here would probably be to streamline, so to have one unified body that looks after party and election finance, not to let it sort of scattered in different institutions or in different pieces of legislation. Good. A last thing, maybe on the sanctioning, I mentioned this at the beginning. So we could have the best standards in banning, in preventing, or trying to prevent at least, illicit money running into the campaign. However, if our sanctioning regime is not strong enough and doesn't meet some of the good international principles that I mentioned here, I don't think it's serving any purpose. For example, if you have a violation for which parties don't mind to pay a fine, that sanction is just not deterring the party or the candidate from, doing it again. So sanction regime is extremely important element when you are speaking about party and election finance regulation. So if you leave this aside, in our case, for example, I think there is lots of room in Albania's legislation to sort of improve the sanction regime. I think it's rather weak when it comes to that. So just don't make the same mistake. I think the civil society here has to push for a proper sanctioning regime. If we don't have it in place, okay. Everybody can be happy in setting the standards. We have great standards in how we oversee and monitor party and election finance, but then, sanction can be an issue if it's not properly enforced. I think that was it. Happy to respond to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Jorge Valladares, expert for political integrity from Transparency International, Germany. Thank you. We are looking forward to your analysis and recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to all of you. I am I'm a true admirer of the work that Mons does in your country, and also we are proud partners in the Transparency International anti-corruption movement. In particular, the work on political finance is where at least to in my own experience, is where I've benefited the most from Mons monitoring of election campaigns, and also the policy recommendations that has provided to the improvement of the political finance systems in Montenegro. I wanted to take advantage of I believe being the last to speak, and also having listened with much attention to the colleagues who have gone before me, to highlight only the prospective part of the topic. So let me just say briefly how much I agree with, for instance, the concerns about the importance of transparency in campaign financing in Europe, and also this observation that was made about whether private funding may be decreasing in the context of declining membership or in political parties, etc. I would say maybe in part because transparency of political finance in Europe is still a work in progress. No, very recently, ahead of the European elections, we had the chance to see a very thorough overview of how transparency laws work in political finance or campaign finance in different countries in Europe. And we could see how over the last 5 years, more or less half of the money that's been donated cannot be accounted for in terms of what's the origin. Though I would say it's important also to highlight that indeed having private funding must be considered essential in the funding of politics. Parties cannot just only rely on state funding as the only source of funding. I think political funding, when we discuss this, should also be seen as a matter of political participation, but then this political funding must voice genuine, legitimate interests of citizens. I also want to take advantage of what Ivan has said with regards to the role of criminal money, on illicit money in politics. I think this year that's been coined the year of elections, we've seen so many cases where illicit money has managed to leak through the loopholes and play a role of influence in election campaigns. I don't want to go into details, but we've seen this very surreal case in Moldova where money was sent in cash through people, these cash mules that were flying through Moscow airport and bringing 3,000, 5,000, 7,000 euros in cash in a pattern. In one day, custom authorities detained or confiscated up to 1.5 million, the equivalent of 1.5 million euros. And it's calculated that over 13 million of euros were later deposited in bank accounts of private citizens in Moldova as top up for pensions or just handouts to influence their vote. No, and this may have been anything from 120,000 people, 300,000. Others estimate that there were at least 1 million transactions through sanctioned Russian banks. Anyway, and then lastly, I also want to take advantage of the last presentation, highlighting some of the most important loopholes in this topic. And I want to do that to make use of my time just to propose or to share with you what Transparency International is doing with regards to the issue of integrity and political financing. I wanted to share with you that in the sorry, and if I manage to share my screen, yes, I wanted to share with you that this week on the 12th, so this week on Thursday, Transparency International will be releasing a new set of standards for the integrity in political financing. The reason we're doing this is because of everything that's been said in this panel, that there are problems, outstanding problems that do not only concern countries in Europe, but also concern countries around the world. We should be reminded that campaign finance is the weakest link in electoral integrity around the world. There is a yearly evaluation of elections around the world by the Electoral Integrity Project that places campaign finance as the weakest link or the lowest performing area in this. And this is because there is mostly lack of transparency, and there is of who donates money to campaigns, either political parties or candidates, but also there is a lack of enforcement of already weak rules around the world. So if I manage to share my screen or have control over my presentation, I would like to walk you through what at Transparency International we want to yeah. So I hope you can see my screen now, and I just wanted to share with you that. So in 2009, Transparency International had the standards on political funding and favors. It's been 15 years since then. As it's been said, elections today or political financing today faces so many new challenges of the nature of financing has changed, but also the ways to exert influence using money have also evolved. No? So during this year, we've been going through a very long but deep consultation, not only with the chapters that make up the movement, but also with external experts from different international electoral observation organizations and people working on this field for long. And because we also believe that rules need to be improved around the world. There is only one global principle that is binding, one global commitment, binding global commitment with regards to transparency that is placed on the in Article 7.3 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And this principle only commits countries to uphold transparency of their political funding. To date, a third of countries around the world still don't have any rule about reportable transparency. And those countries that do have, less than a third of them actually publish information on digital formats online. So only that principle is widely disregarded. When we think of the integrity in political finance globally, we think of 6 principles that need to be upheld. First, of course, needs to be transparent. Second, the money that comes into politics needs to be clean, not only originate from legitimate sources, but also be channeled through legal means. Money should not give anyone an undue advantage, so there should be a level playing field, also in financial terms. Then there should be money to level up those groups that are marginalized in participating in politics. And that also includes, of course, the role of women, which is the group that is the biggest of those groups that is widely underrepresented around the world in politics. Fifth, the state should be neutral, and all public money and resources need to be used with fairness, but also with scrutiny of the not giving a specific candidate an undue advantage. And finally, something that I would like to stress, these rules need to be upheld, need to be enforced, implemented, and monitored. Accountability is a basic principle for any rule to work. Let me just briefly say what the new Transparency International standards on the integrity of political financing will include. With regards to transparency, of course, we want to also bring up this the principles to the new era where reporting, so not only bookkeeping, but also reporting and disclosure should be supported by digital formats, but also be done in a way that helps voters make informed choices. I think in the 21st century, we can no longer be waiting for political finance reports to be disclosed the year after the election. I think we should aspire to prompt disclosure like it happens already in Czechia or Slovakia, where political parties and candidates set up bank accounts that the law mandates should be public. So you can see in real time who is putting money into each of those accounts. This already happens in many countries, prompt disclosure that donations need to be disclosed within days after being made. So voters can understand whether any policy proposal is making it to electoral discourse by its own merits or because of the power of the sponsors of that candidate. No? Second, money needs to be clean. And I think it's about time for political parties also to exercise some minimum due diligence. So at least to understand who the donor is, and anonymous donations or the donations made by shell companies or any company that does not disclose the beneficial ownership. Here, one classic vehicle to put dark money, dirty money into elections or political parties or to interfere with political discourse is indeed third parties. As it has just been said, these front, shell, fake, straw donors, NGOs, or any other organization that is suspiciously putting or participating in electoral discourse without any track record or just being created for the sake of funneling these efforts should be, of course, asked to report who is giving them money, etc. The right of a group to participate as a collective politics should not be curtailed, but at least they should play by the same rules. Candidates and parties should also, they must uphold. Third, there must be a level playing field. I mean, of course, we've been talking about restrictions on donations and spending, but I think there should also be a rethinking of how direct and indirect public financing is being done. Matching it to some private donation schemes, so to create incentives for parties to collect small donations should probably be on the cards. And then there should also be some clear rules within the party governance to distribute this money among different candidates. We've seen in many parts of the world where money is given to political parties as part of public budgets. This is abused by or is used only to support specific candidates or activities that are close to the leader, but not to all other candidates within the party or members. Fourth, we also think that a modern political finance regulation should include provisions to level up the participation of marginalized communities. Women, as you know, still lag behind in terms of political participation. So, and there is an increasing number of not only international commitment, regional ones, but also some practices at national level of earmarking money for the purpose of promoting public participation of women in politics. So therefore, this information should be disclosed publicly, disaggregated, and also there should be stricter guidelines on how to use that money to prevent its misuse, as it may happen so many times. Fifth, of course, the state should be neutral. We've seen so many times not only how vehicles, buildings are used, but also more sophisticated at the grand scale ways of clientelism and patronage are used to influence the electoral outcomes. Only last year, I mean, to mention two examples of Latin America, both in Guatemala and Argentina, the scale of the manipulation of policies and budgets to influence voters was very massive. No, tax rebates for domestic tourism or subsidies to some specific public services that were targeted to specific pockets of the population during the election campaign were very gross misuse of public resources for the purpose of manipulating or influencing voters in the election. And then finally, and this is very important, is there should be proper accountability. There should be oversight bodies with the resources, the capacities to uphold the rules and make them work in practice. There should not only be a mandated oversight body or bodies, plurality of them, as in many countries that is the case. But most importantly, there should be mandated by the law cooperation between different law enforcement agencies, not only political finance oversight agencies, but also the police, prosecutor offices, etc. Ivan also mentioned this point. I think is crucial. In one of these cases that we've been following through the chapters, for instance, in Indonesia, there was about 13 million US dollars being funneled to the accounts of 23 different party treasurers that were coming from illicit activities such as logging or gambling industries, etc. Mostly environmental crimes, but also some other illicit activities. This was detected by a very competent and ready intelligence finance unit, and this was reported to the Political Finance Oversight Agency. There are like at least 3 different agencies that have some mandate. None of them took action to make any research, any investigation with regards to this money, which was by all accounts of illicit origin and therefore banned. So, and this is because they don't feel they have the proper mandate, or they don't have the collaboration between these different branches of government in place to make it happen. So I think this is an important aspect, is perhaps the most important one. I always argue with colleagues that, or sometimes argue with them, that we should perhaps always start with accountability and then everything else. No? Without an agency that has the mandate and resources, this cannot happen. I mean, any of this may not ever happen. So just my final word, we would like to see many of these principles or provisions elevated to a global standard. We think the United Nations Convention Against Corruption provides the forum, the space for that. There is one non-binding commitment that could perhaps be unpacked, and guidelines for its implementation should be provided. We will try to do this, and we are trying to do this in the UNCAC system, and we will double our efforts during 2025. So by the next time the Conference of State Parties meet in Doha, there is a resolution that elevates many of these recommendations to a global standard that could be then therefore implemented by different states, the 191 states parties to this convention. That's our goal. I am sharing a QR code for the website where you will find these principles published already on this Thursday, the 12th of December. This is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. If there are no changes, having in mind that we didn't manage to get in touch with Quentin Reed, who was announced in the agenda, and if you have no concrete questions for any of the people that have participated in the panel, I would like to conclude this session, then to have a short break since we are already late according to the agenda, and then we will come back to the second panel where you will hear what the representatives of the political parties want to say about this topic, also the competent and supervisory institutions. Concrete results in the election reform, electoral reform. So I would like to call it, to give it a different title, From Promises to Promises, since for 5 years after the government has changed and the representatives of the new government have been transparent the old government for non-transparent financing, party employment, functioners, campaign. According to the assessment of many, they keep doing the same things. There's no improvement of legislation, and this is why we are forced to listen and the experts to repeat the old or somewhat innovative recommendations. There are no solutions to the old affairs from this area, like the affair recording, the affair envelope. When it comes to this affair, there is a quite farcic trial for money laundering, the party who was responsible for this whole story, this whole affair, they paid misdemeanor fine. I'm speaking about the DPS, Democratic Party of Socialists, and in the meantime, we have some new affairs to which the judiciary still doesn't have a comprehensive response, and the epilogue of this whole story cannot be seen, like, for example, the Dog One affair. We raise the questions to those who are political actors and stakeholders, those who are supervising these procedures. But I would like to start from diagnosis. So I would like to start with Lazar Kardanic from the Investigative Center MANS. So Lazar, at the very start, please tell me. I gave a short introduction from my point of view to what extent the things that you are encountering in the field are compatible with my assessments. Thank you for the introduction, Petra. Thanks to the panelists who took the time to participate at the discussion on this topic, and to all of the participants who have stayed at this last panel, who is usually quite energy draining because it's at the very end of the event. So I will try to be more concrete and to focus this discussion in the direction for which I think that it is needed. What is a fact is that concretely the law on financing of political entities and electoral campaigns, it didn't have to be drafted by the political committee for electoral reform. So if there was political will, this abstract notion in Montenegro, it could have been drafted by the government as well and then referred to the parliament. And since it was referred to the parliament, it was clear that it will be subject of different political conditioning and compromises. And we see the results of this even today. We see that electoral processes that have happened during this year and were very important have been implemented by using the OLO, which has a lot of omissions and gaps and flaws, but they keep using and abusing those gaps quite frequently, just like the previous ruling parties, the current parties still keep using these flaws. And I'm afraid that without concrete and comprehensive reforms of this kind of legislation, they will keep abusing them. And this will keep happening quite frequently and widely. So all of those inherited platforms are surviving now at the service of the new parties, the parties in power. So they expect that the new law will be adopted by the end of the year. I'm not certain how this could be feasible, to be honest, without a concrete public discussion and participation of all of the decision makers and the expert and layman public and the lay public. I'm not sure how this reform could be, how this law could be reformed by the end of the year. How was the public discussion led up until now? How did it go? And can this law be adopted without adjusting or harmonizing the reminder of the legislation, which is important to this matter when it comes to election of MPs and councillors and the role of the agency for combating corruption in this whole story? When it comes to the codes, criminal code of Montenegro, it definitely needs to be amended because concrete steps when it comes to sanctioning of more severe violations when it comes to this law, this will not happen unless it's recognized in the criminal procedure code and criminal code. But when it comes to other things, I think that my interlocutors, my other panelists will be able to better respond to this question. One more question, and I will give the floor then to Mr. Ćalović from the Caucus of PES. So, to what extent you today are getting the information from political parties, since there is this old adagio that this didn't go with all governing parties and their members, how are the 30th of August liberators behaving, how they behaved after this so-called liberation, how are they behaving today? MANS on monthly level is sending requests for free access to information to all of the political parties, and we are trying, based on them, to find out how parties are using the funds from the budget. My colleagues that are dealing concretely with this will give a better response when it comes to which political parties and how they are respecting the law on free access to information and whether they are providing the data or not and to which extent. But I'm certain and I'm aware that in certain parties, among them, there are some who never responded to any of the requests for free access to information, while some others are submitting only fragments, parts of the data. When it comes to money spending, when it comes to the campaign itself, the situation is slightly different since the agency that is mired with administrative obligations when it comes to monitoring the election campaigns. They are not managing to publish all of the data on time, or they are publishing it but not in a readable format. And this makes our job difficult. Sometimes the political parties are quite closed when it comes to spending the money during the campaign. When it comes to state audit institution, and from the point of view of months, none of the parties are behaving properly when it comes to these regulations because they got most of them a single or double negative opinion. So are there at least some tiny steps when it comes to reshaping this legislative platform that should be accompanied by the practical part? Mr. Ćalović, how do you feel 5 years after the all governing parties have been dethroned because you were breathing on the neck of the PS when it comes to their practices? But what do you say about these assessments that you didn't move forward in the meantime? Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I'm very glad that I'm able to attend this conference this year as well. I would focus on the topic immediately. I think that majority of the criticisms that we heard from you and from Mr. Gudinic is on point when it comes to this matter. And I'm not someone who will try to avoid speaking frankly about the work or lack thereof. But since this is December already of this year, allow me to recapitulate or sum up what was done within the Parliamentary Committee for Comprehensive Election Reform. So I would like to start. Sorry for interrupting you. Of course, I will give you the floor again, but since you've said that you agree with these assessments, then you probably agree with the reasons why this is happening. Political parties do not want to let the legislation, and they don't want to give up on the rights that they have according to the current legislation. So we are basically behaving in the same way as DPS did. Allow me just to address the public. So as I've said, to sum up, the committee was established late last year. We have the consensus model, so we have equal number of members from the governing party and opposition parties, and none of the sessions can be scheduled or led unless the two co-presidents agree on this. What I need to highlight is that the first part of the year was quite turbulent when it comes to work of the committee. There was a blockage by DPS due to the situation in Shavnik. It's paradoxical and banal, but the comprehensive election reform was put on hold because of the situation in Shavnik, which has nothing to do with the work of the committee. This is an external matter which can influence the work of the committee, and this is an essential flaw of this committee because there might be another external thing that might pop up and slow down the work on the reforms, but we managed to overcome this challenge. This was to the detriment of the political entity that I'm representing. So we essentially started working in June. We agreed that we need to work on amending the law on financing political parties and election campaigns, which is the priority law when it comes to the election reform and the most complex one as well. Since June up until now, there was more than 10 sessions of the work group working on the draft law. And what I have to say that all of these sessions of the work group were public platforms, since on the work on this law, we had participating not only members of the committee, but also stakeholders from the civil sector and state institutions. So basically everyone that was interested in this matter had the opportunity that within the work group directly participate and give their suggestions. And what is also something that I wanted to highlight is that all of the stakeholders that had suggestions that were prepared in advance, they submitted these suggestions to the work group, and the work group has gone through all of them. So, for example, months suggestions, SEMI's suggestions, Agency for Prevention of Corruption suggestions, state audit institutions suggestions. Everybody who submitted them, they were deliberated during these 10 sessions, and each article was revised, and we included all of the recommendations and discussed them. So when do you expect that the law will be adopted? Moment to finish. Yes, this will all be part of my response. So I personally and the Deputy Speaker have requested the opinion from Andreina, and we got their opinion in September. In September, we organized the conference where Audit presented their opinion to this draft law. And then through cooperation with the UK's embassy, we got an expert who will draft the draft law, taking into account all of the recommendations and the opinion of Odir on this law. And also, I have to point out the constructive role of NTI, who facilitated an event in Budva, where we had all of the MPs from the parliament who were members of the committee. And we, as the MPs, gave suggestions to the law itself in cooperation, of course, with other members of the expanded committee. We had a session in late November with an expert who is working on the draft law based on the recommendations that everybody provided. We presented a set of priority amendments to the law, and the amendments reflected in Odir's opinion and other amendments which have more priority, according to my opinion. For example, recommendations that have been discussed for several years already when it comes to this law. So while we are discussing at this panel, at the team, actually the Committee for Comprehensive Electoral Reform is agreeing on the final draft that we got from the expert, who is a foreigner. He submitted it in English, so we lost several days because of that. And I expect that this draft will be completed tomorrow or in 2 days' time, and then we will have a session of the committee. We will discuss this draft, since there is a number of entities who participated in the draft, and they were informed with the content of the draft, and we believe that public discussion can be completed during 2 events, which we would organize during a short time frame, most probably next week, the first one, and maybe both one we could organize during next week. The plan is that after this public discussion, that the committee adopts the proposal. Are there going to be amendments? I don't know at this given moment, but everybody is included in the drafting process, so maybe there will not be any amendments. Then we send this version to the European Commission, and then we will refer it to the Parliament, and then we will adopt the law on the day that we get the opinion from the European Commission that it is harmonized, or when we include the suggestions that they will provide. I'm optimistic that this could happen by the end of this year. It depends on the final opinion, but what I could say is that at this given moment, we have the final draft ready and prepared, and it will be presented to the general public in the next few days. Just a small clarification: when you say that practically it's completed or it's in the final phase, what are the key amendments compared to the previously criticized solutions, and what I, the announcement of this topic, mentioned whether the adoption of this law in itself, without other corresponding system-level laws and solutions, makes sense and gives improvements in this area.
Thank you for the question. Then I get the opportunity to speak my mind on that. The question was right. What are the key amendments, key novelties? It is a good question because there are lots of major changes. I want to say my opinion. It is there is a good reason why our citizens in Montenegro say that they have least trust in political institutions. Through the Committee of Election Legislation, I understood the reasons, and I'll tell why. In the context of anti-corruption conference, I want to say that the key grudge was why did you come up with such a conclusion? We got that conclusion much earlier. That's because I was out of politics. I was not involved, and then I saw it was well deserved because the Mapo employment is a form of corruption, and there are some loopholes in the law that give rise to such corruption practices. And that is why we want to see that the full prohibition of employments while the campaign is going on or is on the way. That will be a problem for seasonal jobs, etc. But we have to turn blind eye to that because we have to start from somewhere, and we want to send a clear message, and that is that we are aware of key and crucial problems and why people don't trust political parties. And I expect from my colleagues the commitment to change that, to address that grudge, because this is where, which is very damaging, that was exercised by the previous incumbency, the same repeated by the present incumbency. And that is why I think that we have to do something, and there is a scope for that. Could we be just quicker as we want to allow other speakers, other panelists to speak? There are some indications that we have new spirits, primarily related to this law, and it is about the position of political entities and elections. The law as it is puts the incumbency in advantage over others in the election race. We wanted to give some scope to new players, new political players, so that we have a level playing field. And this is what we incorporated in the new draft of the law. And there was a segment that we also want to dedicate to, and that is the third-party endorsement, third-party finance that needs to be regulated. We decided to regulate this field, and we believe it is a very progressive solution in the context of EU integrations. There are steps made to that end already, and we believe that we could have this law adopted by the end of the year, and this will be a key indicator as to where to go in the coming time. Thank you for this part of interventions. Now, Anna Novakovic-Jurovic from the URA party, actually civic movement URA. You were a part, your party was part of incumbency. You sent DPS to history, allegedly, even though we see that it is much up and about. And the parties that won the elections of August that year claim that they did at least. So how do you see and how do you explain the situation? One cannot trust parties. How do you see the fact that there is no any progress here? You were very often accused that you abused some and breached some of the election rules, that you denied, and ASK helped you in denying that. So let me give my comment. Thank you for inviting me first. Last year at this conference, I spoke to the same topic, and it is well worthwhile that you ask me if we have made something out of that, or we are where we were some year ago. I want to say that in this part on financing political entities, we made a progress since we are coming closer to having the draft ready. We've been when we set up and established the committee that I'm a member of, and that is the Committee for Election Legislation. We promised that in a couple of months we'll have the reform ready, and it was unrealistic promise. I believe that it would be fully realistic if this parliament could exercise its full mandate that it will complete the election reform. I was a member of a working group from the outset, and we pledged that we as opposition representatives will be very constructive because we see it as a very important piece of legislation. After such a long time, we still repeat something that we've repeated so many times before. We have big reserves about the reform approach. So we started with drafting the law without other subsidiary laws, ancillary laws. How do you see it as it is? And what is your position about the fact that it's not a part of package of broader reforms? I think that we didn't get any draft yet from the government, I suppose that they are working on translation, and I hope that we will get to the comments from the Commission ready. We have supported essentially like prohibition of employment during the campaign period. And then the third entities part in the election process will also be addressed. We will revisit the competencies, the list of competencies for anti-corruption agency. Once we get the draft, we will give our position on it as a working group. What I wanted to say is that so far we've proved that partial reforms could be more damaging than useful for society. From my point of view, the problem is that we in the committee didn't start the root and vision from the essence and vision, so that all political entities that are represented in the committee speak their position, articulate their position about many aspects of that. What's the position about direct election of mayors, for example, about the employment during the campaign, about third party endorsement, etc., etc. We should have started that way, building trust in election system directly related to building trust in political entities as a party that advocates open lists. I think that this solution in prospect would increase transparency and build the trust of people in the election process. So they are so closely knit that the law financing aside, it is initial sparkle that can lit the whole process, but unless we deal with the vision and with the stand of those grand issues, we would come into position to start again to do backward, to work backwards and to revisit the party financing again once the vision is over. So there are so many crucial issues where the government was so intransparent, and we in the committee made sure that in the composition of the committee and not in the ranks of the working group, we have representatives of NGOs and civil society, which actually contributed to its transparency. We want, I believe it was mentioned today that we are now to start improving the laws that were adopted by or in the run-up to IBAR and for the sake of IBAR. It is very important, no matter how we communicate with the European Commission, that we make sure that we come up with quality solution without just trying to get to meet the deadlines. So I hope that you come up with the best legislative solutions. And then the employment during the campaigning period, there was a good documentary recently released and broadcast. We saw that they do employ people and their supporters in between campaigns. So how can you solve the problem by just limiting it to the pre-election period? You as a party, you took the credentials or you wanted to credit yourself during your tenure that you reformed judiciary. Could you reflect upon that and tell us how you see it? You've argued there is a farcical trial now we have the case envelope where one individual, Mr. Stepovic, is indicted as a member of organized criminal gang, while VPS stands aside as a party. We credit for reforms of judiciary. I didn't want to dismiss you for that. No, I just wanted you to make your presentation of the facts on that. We have worked actively on amending the laws that we amended the laws. We managed to make sure that the laws were amended and that led up to the appointment of the new special prosecutor for special state prosecutor. We indicated even then that by making that change, and it's not only perceived by us as such, but also by international partners as such, is that they thought that we have improved on this account, that the prosecution is reformed, and that they have good track record. As for the topics you mentioned and the cases that we call affairs, there is an affair we as a political party, but also are just like you, very much interested in the epilogue. We have made public calls, and I've used this opportunity to reiterate it. We expect these cases see an epilogue, which is very important to build trust. The old indictments, by many remarks of experts, were seen as faulty, and how come they've survived as such? Let me just assume, based on the arguments that we get from special prosecutor, and that is that they have limited capacities technically and the number of people who can work on those cases and who draw drop those indictments, but it's very important, I dare say, that it is of utmost importance that we see those cases tried and end up in final ruling, and it is very important not only for us but for our citizens and gaining trust in institutions. The documentary that you mentioned indicated how political entities took their abuse their rights and positions to get their supporters employed. So there are some political entities, if those political entities try to get away with impunity, it doesn't, whether they will have it or not depends on our institutions. Institutions need to be relieved of partisan influence, and only then we could hope to have the law applied well and duly. So the relief of the partisan influence is very important. Election Commission, public broadcast, anti-corruption agency, employment agency, etc., etc. It is a pity that Democrats are not here because Democrats have been seen as champions of party employments. And there was a kind of yes, phrase that was used by once by DPS politician who said one job, 4 votes. The new incumbency transformed into 4 employments, 1 vote in an anecdotal way. Now, you as the acting director of anti-corruption agency, could you tell us how is your work affected by faulty legislation? So you see lots of politicians ridiculing some of your decisions as a result, dismissing them, even by public releases and in their public interventions. How do you think the situation go towards improvement? How can you improve your work? Let me mention 4 segments that colleagues mentioned. It is very discouraging. We are now making decisions about from 2018, and they are unrelated with the new law. We just have to apply the law valid at the time. You mentioned the case which led to misdemeanor court where the mayor declared that he's not an incumbency. Instead, it is the municipality. So he actually used this faulty provision to get away without any fine. There were some officials who have no working hours, and that is how you decided the case of, let's say, president who took part in a campaign during his office hours. No, we will have information about that in coming days. We won't be out of the pre-election period even until the March 2026. We will have more elections, don't worry. So we are constantly in election campaign period. Do you see that we have situations where the elections last for 90 days? You call for elections in March, and then the registration starts, and lots of formal omissions are in place. We have big sanctions for formal omissions. For example, if they're a day late, the fine is 5,000, whereas for some bigger breaches, there is no fines. How do you see those new provisions? We saw that they're not yet put into the draft, a final draft, but they are imminent.
A lot of good things were done. What is good, what is bad? What we saw, we had the situation with the campaign by third parties to see what will happen with this, whether all this will be prohibited or not. I don't know what will be decided. We talked about this a lot. Is it enough to prohibit employment during campaign employment? This was prohibited in 2013, if I remember correctly. This was then, if I remember correctly, formally or informally, and then it changed because it was considered unconstitutional, etc. But when it comes to the agency, what we are concerned, of course, we'll respect this. This is one of the priorities when it comes to election campaigns. If we stick to this provision regarding prohibition of employment, but what, for example, if there is a flood, you will not be able to employ anyone if there is an election campaign going on. These are all problems which could happen, but the things that have been corrected, I believe, we have 1 million euros earmarked for the political parties and their officers based on the political agreement from 1993. This is very bad. Also, 40 million euros will be shared between political parties from the budget at the local and national level for their office spaces. Whether this will be increased or decreased, I don't know. If we will have parliament elections with this legislation, with the next budget, the limit for consumption will be 3 million euros almost. This is a huge limit. So now the political parties were not even close to this limit, but somebody could come with 3 million euros for campaign and win the elections. This could happen because there are more suspicions and other things regarding the money being spent during the campaigns. We'll come to this. Also, during Podgorica elections, the limit was 140,000 euros per political entity, which is very low for the capital city of Podgorica, especially having in mind that parties from public funds got almost 14 million euros in total during this year. And also there's the situation that we as the agency, we are controlling the situation. The experts are here. So we are controlling different parameters regarding cost of the campaign. We look at the discounts, activities, and other things. This is all controlled. This is included in the law. But when we control all of this, when we do our job, when the parties submit a report, for example, for political elections, there were 18 irregularities when some things were not reported, ranging from 1,000 to 15,000 euros. They did not comment on this, but there are no sanctions. So we make the conclusions, but there are no sanctions, no fines, no fees, no nothing. So, and also state audit institution is giving some negative opinions according to their criteria, which is unknown to me in general, but there are some standards. I think that they should be they should also be able to sanction them if they get a double negative opinion. For example, maybe they should be fined with withdrawing the amount of funds equal to 1 month of the means provided to them, or 3 months provided to them from the state budget. But the most important thing is that this is not a job for a single institution. And your question is related to this. So a single institution cannot do this. So if the advertising is prohibited in a media outlet, or there is a certain threshold, and they go above that threshold, they just pay the fine, and which is very low compared to the benefits that they get. So the other agencies need to be involved, and also like state audit institution. Next year they will be controlling ourselves as well, and the parties for everything that has happened in Podgorica, in Budva. So we have some announcements, but without sanctions, actually. The most important thing is the prosecution, the case that you mentioned, the case, the fair envelope. And if it happens that there is an envelope or a bag of money, this is the job for the prosecution. But can we leave it all to the prosecution? It's not only about prosecution. When we speak about them, we are speaking about a liberated part of the segment, Special State Prosecutor's Office. And there you also have some people who, according to the legislation, they are part of the previous system. So can we expect that the prosecution resolves all of the situations like illegally appointed head of the public service, although nobody from the administrative level, administrative committee actually is doing anything to resolve this issue. So can we rely on the special prosecutor's office for everything? Shouldn't we have the prosecutor's office as the final instance, or the instance which is correcting some radical forms of this kind of a behavior, like in the case of Dokwon or envelope affair? So let's try some simple thing that we haven't tried. Let's try to prescribe a clear norm in the criminal code which will enable us to act promptly and swiftly. But it's up to the legislators, right? Yes, it's up to the legislators because we need this huge reform of election legislation. So it's up to those who didn't have an interest to change anything, because when it comes to the envelope, I think that we should not have another case of similar to this one, and then to have a trial only for money laundering, because everything that we are discussing now as a society, we are all losing the institutions, the society, the parties are losing their integrity. Why? Because we cannot sit down and say, okay, these are the rules, and that's it. Are we going to prohibit or to ban the opening of infrastructural projects? So to participation in these grand ceremonies, okay, let's do this. But the rules are prescribed by those who are supposed to be targets of this supervision, and it's not in their interest to do this. So would this be your assessment, Milica, program director of the Center for Democratic Transition, Milica Kovačević? Well, yes. Very gladly, I criticize the prosecution and Agency for Prevention of Corruption when it comes to this, because we are in the process of adoption of new law and election reforms, but we need to speak about what the legislator did first and foremost. So from everything that the colleagues have said, we can see that the laws are being adopted in order to resolve a problem or to resolve an area, to organize a certain area. So like, for example, financing from abroad or massive abuse of public resources, or inefficient supervision and reporting, which tell us about the need to increase objectiveness, professionalism of the Agency for Prevention of Corruption, and ineffective sanctions, absolutely, because for majority of the omissions, you can give some minimum misdemeanor sanctions or fines, or even non-existing ones, yes. And impunity for everything that somebody did in the previous period. And what we said for the prosecution, this is also related. Okay, the prosecution can deal with these topics only if something that is considered a criminal offense as defined in the criminal code happens. So the envelope affair and what happened there, or the affair with financing of DF in 2016, and there was an investigation and proceedings, like, I don't know if this is completed, if this is finalized regarding Mr. Medovic and people from PCP, but this was not prohibited by the law. Illegal financing was not considered as a criminal offense. So this is why it was considered as money laundering at the time. And this is why it's essentially prolonged for so many years, and qualification cannot change, because when it was committed, it was not considered as a criminal offense. because Migos Stipović was considered as member of the organized criminal group of Duško Knežević. And also the norm introduced in 2017, this was limiting for when it comes to those receiving the money, because it's only in case when the money was from the proceeds of crimes. So if you're trying to buy them with that kind of money, then it's a criminal offense. And we know how these kinds of investigations are going not well. And there are some things where the prosecution could have acted. So in 2013, for example, there was abuse of state property for the purpose of elections defined as a criminal offense. We requested from the Judicial Council the official information was that by the end of 2023, in courts in Montenegro, there was not a single case regarding abuse of state resources. So people who live here understand how absurd this is. And just to come back briefly to this law, these issues in order. So this law, first of all, is not being drafted because it's on the list of priorities when it comes to Chapter 23. This was the reason to push it forward, and that we supported at the committee to start working on this law. But at the committee, no other texts or texts of the draft law were read, and I agree very much with Ms. Novakovic when this is a system level omission. Yes, the committee, the first proposal of CDT at the first session of this parliamentary committee was to expand the competencies of the committee when it comes to expanding on the other laws which need to be amended so that the reform can be comprehensive and purposeful. The criminal code is not part of the reform. There was no willingness at the parliamentary committee. But you need to amend the law on political parties and other laws. So Agency for Prevention of Corruption has not been reformed, and no directors were appointed there by case. We need to change things from the system level, to change the council and other things regulating the independence of this institution and the norms which are being adopted. If they are not accompanied with adequate sanctions and other reforms in other laws, will not result in any effects. Prohibition on employment during election campaign. Okay, this is fine, but we can see that deployments are happening throughout the year without any breaks. And then somebody might say that we do not have party level employment. So, for example, if it was large, so in practice, large systems were waiting with the job classification legislation for after the elections, and then they would massively employ people, but they would hire them temporarily only. And this law, so this will not resolve the problem. This is the important message. But if nothing is done in the field of party employment in other areas, then it will not produce the desired effect, which is that people vote for those offering them jobs. This will keep happening outside of this. And two important things which were mentioned. The story about the quality of political parties is terribly important. Yes, I haven't seen the final proposal, so when it comes to equalizing, this has not been made, but the situation is that large parties get multi-million amounts for their work, which they use for financing elections, or they save and spend everything on elections, or they take loans and they repay them from the money that they get paid. But small parties get enough funds only to maintain their central operations, and if there is no limit, purposeful one when it comes to election expenditures, this will mean that we didn't achieve anything, because if you are able, you will get huge amounts of donations, private ones, because citizens trust you, but it's a different thing when somebody gets 1 million for a campaign and the other entity gets 100,000 for a campaign. So Anna mentioned open lists, and I would like to conclude with this. We did not discuss what are the goals of the reform. Hence, open lists are not only URA's program, but also numerous political parties were for this, and if we decide to do this, this law will need to be amended because it was written for a different election system and through the work group itself. And these 10 meetings, I have to say here openly that presence of MPs of the Montenegro National Parliament was below any level. So there were two co-presidents, Ms. Novakovic and Mr. Tsambay, continuously. When it comes to the others, they were coming or never, or only occasionally. But we had very few opinions, so I don't know. I have to tell you that I came there regularly, so if you ask me who thinks what about these amendments, there are not that many clear statements. One interesting thing, if we did not define the final outcome in the end, like open lists, then this law will need to be amended immediately. So, Mr. Ćalović, this seems like a question right for you. There's enough, we had enough of those who just lead us from one marketing step to another and cosmetic changes only. How is it possible that you, at this given moment, and you've started with the comprehensive election reform, you do not have even this elementary information? Do you want open lists or not? Why are we wasting time? Why we keep going in circles? So why do we want to have this conclusion that maybe this time next year we will be speaking about these same things, maybe with different actors and panelists, but the things are the same. So the decision when it comes to establishment of the Committee for Comprehensive Election Reform, it has also the definition of the main goals of the committee and its work. And I'd say that harmonization of our election legislation with the recommendations of ODIHR and standards of the EU is the main purpose, main goal. Do we know where we want to go? Do you have among yourselves a consensus in which direction we are heading to, for which model we have opted for? I think that Milica Kovacevic has made a good point there. Or are we going to always come back to make one step forward and then two steps back with these kinds of laws? The goal of the election reform is reflected in the establishment of this committee. Maybe its work is not interesting, but it is focusing on alignment of our election legislation with the standards of the EU and recommendations of ODIHR and European Commission. This would be the idea behind the committee in brief. And when it comes to fundamental changes, thorough changes of the election system, of course, it was discussed, of course, not in front of the cameras, but this is a topic which keeps being imposed. And when it comes to open list, a large number of citizens believe that we should start using this model. But as somebody who is in the parliament for only a year and who has been working on these issues only for a year during the previous period, we didn't have anything when it comes to possible changes of election legislation. So the Election Reform Committee, I think the first time that it was established, it was 3 or 4 communications ago. They should have completed the job that we are working on, but we started from ground up there. We didn't have anything when it comes to what they did in the previous communications. So there is no fundamental analysis of the concept of open lists. And my political entity and we did the research for ourselves. When it comes to comparative practices and these open lists, we think that there is a possibility to introduce them in Montenegro very efficiently and that they could function having in mind our electoral system in this context. And the analysis has shown that it is justified to go in this direction if this will raise the trust of citizens in political entities, because we believe that the current situation reflects a low level of trust in political entities. But why we didn't start from this point, from this conclusion? Unfortunately, yes, this is correct. We are coming back to the integral criticism that I supported at the very start, and this is that the committee unfortunately managed to agree on amending only one law during this year. Hopefully, by the end of this session, and we have prepared this document, this is the roadmap with a declaration. And it seems to me that Movement Europe now likes these political declarations like Barometer 26. And all of the political entities will have to adopt this, accept this, and I think that this declaration can be a good starting grounds that at a much higher level we discussed about wholesome change of the election system. Can we implement the election reform without comprehensive election reform according to the standards of the EU without open list? Absolutely yes. I even think that the EU is supporting us that we do not go with a comprehensive reform. They are more advocating for keeping the existing system because it's much simpler when it comes to further progress of Montenegro through the implementation of their recommendations and adoption of this law. We are completed all of the obligations when it comes to the EU and this segment, but the question is related to the trust of citizens in our election system.
I think it is the interest of the citizens who will have to live with it. Europe Now movement, we think on long terms, and we have to take on board diverse opinions of political entities, and there is no consensus about open lists. No open interest in doing that in this year. By the end of this year, we will, as political entity, offer a very good solution for this concept, and it could, as such, be appropriate for a civil sector, for society, etc. Lazar Gadinic wanted to add something. Thank you. Let me add something in relation to what I heard from the previous speakers. I didn't hear or saw anywhere that the law recognizes the element of officials campaigning or campaigning officials. We saw high officials very eager to use their public offices campaign for elections. We saw comprehensive abuse of office in that regard, and it hasn't been recognized as such by law. So ASK has its hands tied for that. And we now talk about working hours for some top officials and so on and so forth. We saw that top officials who exercise who are in office have this position altitude as they are to get involved with the title of office into the campaign. So we see that there is also some money coming to our campaign, private donations, where we checked some individuals and saw that by no means they had possibility to give any donations. So we have hidden costs. We see that campaigns spend loads of money and we cannot track the money properly, where it comes from. And we see also parties who present invoices that are unpaid, especially those for the media. And there we have hidden costs and contributions. It has also not found its way into the new draft. And this is something we should dedicate to and we should talk about. Very briefly, because there are people who want to take the floor too. Let me say that I have now the opportunity to directly respond to some of the elements you have stressed. The officials, campaigning officials, is a phenomenon that we should count on. And when we put it into the law, then we we have to think of those ceremonies where some new projects are opened or inaugurated should be started to be prohibited. There are provisions that could be easily twisted to someone's interest, and we saw that, and we have already actually prescribed that people have to give their donations by transfers to bank accounts, so we cannot. We will not afford and allow the cash payments. All other payments would be prohibited. So someone cannot come with a cash to the bank and request a transfer. It has to be account from account. This is why we want to see how these individuals donate the money to the campaign, and I believe it will work in practice. There is no purpose in having, in this context of new and emerging public political entities, should not be put in any lenient but fair position. We should allow for donations and contributions. We have accommodated some decent amounts, and the lists should be considered in such a way that so the donations should not cumulatively, it should be looked at cumulative and analyzed as such. Cumulatively and analyzed as such. We've been open, we didn't act restrictively too much to restrict their activities, but we believe that if we put this request that all contributions should be paid account from account would be a step forward to better transparency. Are there questions? Mr. Ćalović inspired me. What Lazarus said, we looked at how modus operandi worked with having money into the legal flows. So we cannot have people walking around with the cash and doing that. So now with what we could see is that money is paid later, or that it falls out of scope of observation. What I'm interested in hearing is, do you think that it is interesting to criminalize some of the provisions from the law that entail just misdemeanor accountability or misdemeanor offenses? I think that we should correct behavior. We relied on them to do the self-corrective measures, and we ended up with the president doing campaigning during his office hours, and we saw that legislative branch is very active from the point of the government's activity and the parliament. Do you think that there should be made that should be a new item on the list of criminal offenses related to that. We also have the fact that Slavoljub is a member of OKG. And on the other side, we would see him as a mastermind of buying votes for DPS. We will have a special prosecutor here, and we'll have opportunity to ask him about how they prosecute political corruption and what is the role, if the prosecutors were active enough and if they did their job well. They should have checked the pyramid of the Kovata case. It wouldn't end up with Slavoljub Stjepović only. When it comes to this, after the Kovata affair started, the DPS leader said that Duško Knežević was not the only person who gave money and inserted money in the payment system in this way, and that I saw very many donations of that kind. So it was kind of lame press release from Maskay Supreme Audit Institution. Those donations were not recorded, and this is something that insults the reason, because unless we change the legislation significantly and meaningfully, we will see many more affairs like this that we nicknamed envelope. Thank you for your question. As for campaigning officials, I want to say that we should set aside whether someone is a top official throughout the day or not, and then what are the state assets and how we consider state assets to be, and what's the status of state assets during the campaigning, meaning their use in the campaign. There is a scope to improve in this regard. I was surprised by the Ask agency, which they reduced to the concept of working hours and did not look at the abuse of public resources and public assets for the sake of election campaign. So I don't want to give my view on that concrete case without just waiting for the prosecutors to have a final say, rather. As for having the money, illegal money into the legitimate channels, inserted into the legitimate channels, we believe that with this measure, account-to-account transfers will improve the situation. Whether there is an alternative mechanism, whether the cash works or not, it's not the matter. The intention of the political entities, it's up to political entities to work this out together. And we will have with the new system the competent authorities put in situation to monitor and oversee the campaign spending and campaign financing. So we won't end up in a situation where people working as cleaners would contribute huge amounts of money to a party. How to stop the cash inflows that were taken in plastic bags to be distributed to our citizens during campaigning? There has to be a systemic reaction. We believe that the judiciary should have a final say in this and stop this practice. There should be strict and stringent punishments and sanctions for that. I think there is a criminal offense that we adopted, that we added, However, it hasn't been implemented yet, and we didn't have a clean track record about that. This has to be stopped. This has to end. That should be an action of police and prosecutors, and we should see arrests and sanctions to stand in the way of that. So this is the first step, and the low trust in political entities is justified. Anna Novakovic, you have the floor. Let me be brief. Our colleague, Mr. Ćalović, says he will be short, and then he speaks at length. So as for criminalization of some offenses, whether we are in favor of that, yes. As for all these proposals made by months and in relation to election legislation was analyzed by us, and we have adopted and approved of your proposal on amending criminal legislation that we didn't discuss at the meetings that I attended. We left it for some future amendments in the pipeline, and that is why I see it as refuted for the time being, and it was something that we should address systemically and comprehensively. So that this law could address this part, as there were very many comments about partisan employment. This is something that should be part of reform of public administration and not of this law. We didn't address this issue, even though this is not because we believe it's not our mandate. So in these couple of months, we have seen how many loopholes we have. And yeah, it is logical that opposition is critical all the time, but I want to say that we want to be constructive, and we showed what are the gaps and flaws in the systemic approach, and this is something that we will insist upon. I want to repeat, I haven't seen the draft, and I want to say that also public consultations should last longer, so that because we should not sacrifice the quality to the speed. If this and those solutions have to be, if they have to be improved, it would be more meaningful to give an extra month to finish it, so that we have a comprehensive and well-rounded piece of legislation. We have been a bit longer than scheduled, so let's stop it here.